Boa tarde ou boa noite a todos, estamos quase de noite. Bem-vindos ao primeiro workshop nacional sobre colisão de aves em vidraças. Good evening, I would like to welcome everybody to the Bird Window Collision Workshop. Meu nome é Helena Baques, eu sou do Clube de Observadores de Aves de Porto Alegre e fui responsável pela coordenação desse evento junto com um grupo grande de voluntários. Mas antes da gente iniciar, eu vou compartilhar uma tela com algumas das instruções para a gente ter esse evento correndo mais tranquilo. Bom, importante que os microfones e as câmeras, eles vão permanecer desligados, não habilitados durante todo o tempo de apresentação dos painelistas. E no final do painel, nós vamos abrir para todo mundo para poder se manifestar, fazer perguntas ou considerações. Aí, nesse momento, as câmeras e os microfones vão ficar habilitados para todos. Quem quiser se manifestar, levante a mão e só ligue o microfone e câmera quando chamado pelo moderador para fazer suas perguntas. A gente tem um tempo bem curto, a gente quer aproveitar ao máximo os nossos painelistas. Então, é possível que a gente não tenha tempo para todo mundo fazer perguntas, tá? A gente também está com voluntários fazendo coletas de perguntas no chat aqui do Zoom e do YouTube e respondendo alguma dúvida que eles consigam responder na hora, auxiliando em algum ponto que for necessário. Bom, e agora... Bom, e agora vamos para o evento em si. Eu gostaria, em primeiro lugar, de dizer que esse evento só foi possível graças ao apoio que a gente teve e ajuda desse grande grupo de voluntários do Clube de Observadores de Aves de Porto Alegre e dos nossos parceiros, a SAVE Brasil, Avistar e Ecoaves, a quem eu agradeço muito o engajamento nessa causa. Eu agradeço também a Guardian Vidros, que nos auxiliou com patrocínio, e, em especial, aos nossos painelistas e moderadores, que se disponibilizaram a contribuir com esses nossos esforços para colocar esse tema em pauta para um público mais amplo aqui no Brasil e começar a mostrar que existe solução para esse problema. Thank you, Daniel, Chris, Piratelli, and Matthew. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Obrigado a todos, muito obrigado, é um prazer tê-los aqui conosco.
Pedro, a gente...
desculpa, acho que pegou a tradução quando você falou em inglês, eu não ouvi você me chamando. Desculpa. Boa noite a todos. Sou o Pedro Develay, diretor da SAVE Brasil. Para a gente da SAVE é uma grande alegria estar apoiando e participando, ajudando a realização desse evento. Essa questão do impacto das aves em estruturas espelhadas em vidraças, a gente já trouxe para discussões internas várias vezes, mas a gente nunca chegou a, de fato, ter uma atuação mais concreta. E por quê? Porque dentro da SAVE a gente sempre foi muito focado em questões mais urgentes de conservação, né? Então, espécies criticamente ameaçadas ou hábitats extremamente prioritários. Mas isso não quer dizer de maneira alguma que essa questão é menos importante, né? Mesmo pensando em conservação. Porque se a gente pensa num cidadão mais urbano de uma cidade que está testemunhando e vendo no seu dia a dia aves morrendo, sendo atingidas, né? E batendo nessas vidraças, isso é uma questão muito importante, isso sensibiliza muito. E, na verdade, é um gancho para a gente até começar a falar de questões maiores de conservação. Mas isso é o que a gente vai discutir amanhã na mesa, na mesa que eu vou estar presente, falando um pouco de sensibilização. Mas, enfim, então, eu fico muito contente de a SAVE estar começando a poder atuar mais concretamente através desse workshop nessa questão tão importante. A gente, obviamente, continua com nossas linhas de ação prioritárias, com as espécies criticamente hábitats super prioritários, mas já estamos abrindo novas possibilidades nessas questões importantes. Isso até acho que mostra um pouco o amadurecimento e crescimento da nossa organização, que me dá bastante orgulho. Então, as palestras são super boas, acho que a gente vai aprender muito ao longo desses 2 dias. acho que vão vir com soluções bastante importantes. Agradeço muito ao COA, a Helena, o COA de Porto Alegre, né, que trouxe a gente para essa discussão. Desejo um bom evento para todo mundo. Amanhã, nesse mesmo horário, no final do evento, a gente vai se encontrar de novo no painel sobre sensibilização. E eu passo a palavra para o Paulo Carvalho, do Aves. Gente, obrigado.
Boa noite a todos. Good evening. Eu sou Paulo, da Aves, um dos diretores da Aves, e a gente acabou se envolvendo nesse assunto por uma questão quase que fortuita. Nós começamos a receber diversas denúncias de mortes por colisão de aves contra vidraças, e sendo que, em alguns casos, a gente tinha como atuar junto aos causadores do problema, e saímos atrás da solução para isso, e o material que a gente achou e viu que era muito interessante, muito bem embasado tecnicamente, foi o material produzido pela ABC, né? E, através da doutora Christine Shepard, a gente conseguiu e fez a tradução do guia de construções amigáveis para as aves. Então, esse é um dos primeiros agradecimentos até que eu gostaria de colocar aqui, que é o agradecimento à doutora Christian, que nos apoiou nessa causa, e hoje a gente já tem esse guia traduzido e editado, né, em papel, que já foi uma grande conquista. A gente pode chegar hoje e entregar uma cópia do documento para as pessoas que se interessam pelo assunto, né? E também gostaria já de adiantar um agradecimento à doutora Luciana Imaculada de Paula, do Ministério Público, que muito nos apoiou nessa tarefa de fazer a tradução e impressão do guia. Nós, da Aves, estamos muito orgulhosos de estar participando desse esforço para reduzir a mortandade de aves nas nossas construções, e só lembrando que não é só o vidro, né? Tem uma série de outros aspectos que precisam ser levados em conta para diminuir essa mortandade. Muito obrigado. Eu gostaria agora de passar, então, a palavra para o Guto para fazer a abertura final, vamos dizer, do evento.
Muito bem, boa noite a todos, é um prazer enorme estar aqui com vocês. Queria dar os parabéns aí à iniciativa do COA-POA. Eu vou tirar esse óculos aqui que está com esse reflexo feio, pronto, assim ficou melhor. Dizer que eu estou completamente emocionado com a repercussão desse evento. Olhando a lista de participantes, de inscritos, a gente tem de porteiros de prédios, a gente de Córdoba, do Uruguai, da Costa Rica. Está incrível, assim, é uma mobilização incrível em favor das aves, dezenas e dezenas de arquitetos, pessoas, gestores públicos, pessoal do IBAMA, do ICMBio, de várias secretarias do meio ambiente. Sensacional. É um enorme prazer, uma honra estar aqui com vocês, e parabéns mais uma vez ao COA-POA. É isso que a gente gosta de ver, protagonismo das diversas instituições, e é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Siga o baile.
Muito obrigado, Guto, Pedro e Paulo. Pedro e Paulo ficou bom. Tenho participantes do Moçambique também. Então, a gente está além das Américas. Bom, e agora a gente vai ao que interessa mesmo, que é o primeiro painel, que tem como foco o problema. Queremos discutir e entender melhor o problema, por que as aves colidem em vidros, em outras estruturas, quais as principais causas, qual é o tamanho do problema. E a gente não podia ter melhores convidados, melhor preparados para tratar desse tema, que a Christian Shepard, o professor Daniel Clem e o professor Augusto Piratelli, que, para quem eu dei um desafio da gente tentar começar a dimensionar o problema no Brasil. Como é que a gente pode saber quantas aves morrem no Brasil por ano em função de colisão com o vírus? Bom, e para fazer a moderação desse painel, conduzir esse painel, eu chamo o Matthew Shirts, ou Mateus, como esse americano que adotou o Brasil desde 1984, é chamado por aqui. O Matthew é jornalista, é formado em Ciências Sociais pela Universidade de Berkeley e em História por Stanford, e ele foi diretor da National Geographic, diretor-editor da National Geographic no Brasil, e hoje ele conduz uma iniciativa chamada Fervura no Clima. Matthew, por favor.
Muito obrigado pelo convite. Eu me aproximei desse tema um pouco no tempo que eu editei a revista National Geographic. Eu descobri que eu gosto muito de aves e gosto também das pessoas que gostam de aves. Eu quero agradecer o Guto, que sempre me coloca nestes eventos e lembra de mim. E eu vou já chamar o primeiro painelista, que é o professor Daniel Clem. E eu vou mudar de língua, tá? Eu vou falar inglês agora. Professor Daniel Clem, he is the Sarkis Akopian Professor of Ornithology and Conservation Biology at Muhlenberg College, which is in Pennsylvania. He's studied, Pennsylvania is a state in the United States, in case anyone doesn't know that. He has studied and written about birds for 47 years. His research has influenced the design of buildings, among them the Niagara Falls State Park Observation Tower, and most of his current research is focused on bird window deterrent prototypes. He's a technical consultant to manufacturers of bird-safe sheet glass all over the world. Professor Daniel, can you turn on your camera, please? Good evening. Very nice to see you. You need to unmute your, there we go.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
I've already introduced you, so you can go ahead.
I thought Chris was going to go first. No? Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Share. Okay. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So my latest attempt to inform and capture the attention of those who are able to help protect the birds through windows. My latest effort is a book, and this is the title. It was just released on Saturday. And I've already had a glimpse of all the wonderful slides that my other colleagues are going to be presenting. So what I hope to do is just to give an overview of what's in this book, and it offers a glimpse at the history and the contemporary actions that are being taken to protect birds from sheet glass. So I'm going to go through the chapters and just tell you what the content is, and very briefly, I'll try to read this. It doesn't take that long. It's just the really excerpts from some writing in the book. So the book was written for every citizen on the planet, and its purpose was to attempt to capture a critical mass of people who will be willing to act to make our built environment safe for bird life the world over. Let's see, how can I get rid of this top piece here? So I can, so this is the prologue of the book, and it states that the beginning of 1970s was the first comprehensive study that was conducted on birds and windows. That was 47 years ago or thereabout, and that's almost a half a century. So formal study, writing, and teaching about the lethal threats that cheat glass pose to birds has been done worldwide. This first study happened to be my doctoral dissertation at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, the first comprehensive investigation. And several scientific peer-reviewed research papers by a growing number of investigators thereafter, and they continue to the present. So in chapter 1, it's titled Humans Make Glass and Birds Hit Glass. So glass windows have existed since as long ago as 290 current era, a long time ago. And the history of window glass as a source of bird fatality is similarly ancient and progressive. The public needs information to act meaningfully to stop this senseless loss of attractive and useful life. We know enough already about how to stop it. Without acting to save the birds that provide us with recreational joy at minimum, we weaken and damage our hopes for a healthy world to pass on to our children. We even damage our economy. Making windows safe for birds will reward all humans, whether they care about birds or not, with their continued survival and the many benefits they provide. In chapter 2, I talk about why birds hit windows. Well, birds simply behave as if sheet glass is invisible. Unless marked with visible dirt, soap, or artificial elements, clear and reflective glass is not perceived by birds, humans, or any other backboned animals, based on what we collectively have learned about the makeup and function of their respective visual systems. In chapter 3, I'm talking about how big a problem this is. You'll probably hear a lot about this from a lot of people. But conservatively, it's estimated that 1 million birds a day are killed flying into windows in the US alone. Window kills are a principal avian mortality factor explaining the net loss of 3 billion individual birds, or about 29% of the 1970 abundance of the North American bird population. Window strikes that kill individuals indiscriminately. This is my argument. This is a very, very important point. There are additive mortality factors. Populations are not able to compensate for these kinds of losses to the most unknown degree, adversely affecting and threatening the health of all bird life found within habitats containing human structures with sheet glass and plastic. In chapter 4, Scientific Evidence, Making the Case, here's where I provide extensive observations and detailed experiments revealing and repeatedly validating that sheet glass is invisible to birds. The consequences are that bird window collisions and their damaging resultant mortality occur wherever birds and glass coexist. In chapter 5, what happens when birds strike windows, the cause of death and injury and recuperation. Here I'm talking about head trauma and intracranial hemorrhaging from thousands of specimens that I've x-rayed and done necropsies on. And the principal cause of death seems to be, again, from my analysis, primarily head injuries, head trauma, intracranial hemorrhaging, and additionally, you find many internal skeletal fractures and soft tissue injuries are common consequences of strikes. I make a big deal out of trying to point out in chapter 6 that unless something dramatic happens, these kills are going to continue to take place around the world. And using those specimens, depositing them in authorized museums, are available for structural and functional studies. And they're also available for range extensions. An important paper was done in Australia through window kills, documenting the migration routes of several different species there. I'd like to point out, long before we knew where Kirtland's warbler, which is an endangered bird in North America, where it overwintered and spent its non-breeding grounds, if you took a straight edge from its breeding grounds in northern Michigan, in one of our states, you drew a line through where window kills occurred in Ohio, it would take you right to the Bahamas, giving some hint as to their pattern of movement. Another dramatic note that I have in this particular chapter is to point out that the very first record of a white-bellied emerald hummingbird in El Salvador was discovered in that country's, in Salvador's capital. So, in chapter 6, why do we care? What are the services that birds provide? Well, many, of course. Avian deaths from windows and other human-associated mortality factors pose a growing deleterious effect on the world's ecosystems and the goods and services birds provide them. No one should have to live in a world without birds. No harmful products or actions should deprive the current or future residents or their children of the opportunity to receive the services and joy birds provide. This chapter 8 talks about the many different kinds of historical and contemporary events that have been revealed by many of these studies that are ongoing and that have occurred in the past. So from the 1970s to the present, scientific research papers and accompanying popular articles about bird window collisions have continued to grow. Current publications document extensive details that include quantitative studies revealing species, buildings, environmental conditions, individual injuries and cause of death among strike victims, the level and composition of mortality as a species-specific conservation concern, means to prevent bird window collisions, and a number of reviews updating the latest body of collective knowledge. This growing body of literature has resulted in increased awareness and action among conservation-minded constituencies that now include saving birds from windows as part of their mission. Just as important is the awareness among building industry professionals. A growing number of educational programs targeting the building industry have increased awareness in recent years, but not enough to result in making human structures safe for birds as standard practice or even a regular design consideration. In chapter 9, I'm talking about how to solve this problem. We've got short and long-term solutions to preventing bird window collisions. And there are abundant numbers of these by now, and they're growing every day. Short-term solutions are retrofitting to existing sheet glass, where the whole current human-built environment needs to be treated. Long-term solutions consist of bird-safe novel sheet glass for remodeled and new construction. They consist of visible and invisible, in the case of invisible, UV signals placed on windows, patterns that transform windows into barriers that birds see and avoid by what is often referred to as the 2x4 or the 2x2 rule, which is describing the spacing and orientation of patterning placed on the windows. Importance, of course, being in most cases on surface number 1, which is what architects call the outside surface of a window facing the environment. In chapter 10, legal protection of the vulnerable and the defenseless. History has revealed that the use of legal system is a far more powerful means of stimulating action to protect birds from windows than relying on the voluntary efforts of the many constituencies involved in this important conservation issue. Current legislation to protect birds from the threat of injury and death from striking windows is available at the federal, regional, and local municipal levels. Complexity and confusion have rendered national and regional legislation questionable, and to date, mostly ineffective. But mandatory ordinances and zoning regulations are being adopted by a growing number of municipalities in North America, at least, and these guiding rules are serving as modes for others elsewhere around the world. In chapter 11, what can citizens do as homeowners and advocates? Individual citizens working alone in like-minded support groups, or as members of established conservation organizations can directly and indirectly act to protect birds from windows. If you have the will, time, and energy, do what you can to protect birds from this invisible killer. Recommending bird-safe building practices to legislators, to draft laws and ordinances, building industry professionals such as architects and developers to incorporate bird-safe design and materials in human structures are essential to saving more bird lives from windows. In this chapter, for example, I offer citizens a letter that one could use to introduce the topic to these dignitaries, and also an example of an ordinance that might be used as a template for other municipalities in making those areas and those buildings safe for the animals. In the final chapter, chapter 12, I'm trying to sum things up in a rather short fashion. So here's the sample. Imagine an invisible force indiscriminately killing off members of a population. Leaders and non-leaders alike are disappearing, but the population is hurt more severely by the loss of the strongest and most productive. Individual members do not possess the reasoned ability to identify and understand why their leaders and their kind are declining, let alone counter the damage. Individually nor collectively, they have no ability to be frightened or demoralized, just witnesses to reducing numbers and with it declining population health based on fewer partners to increase and sustain stability. Enter a knowing alien species visitor who can identify and eliminate the invisible force. The visitors become the protectors because they can see what the affected species cannot. By applying protection before it is too late, the hapless and vulnerable are saved. Read windows as the invisible forces affecting birds. Read knowing and caring humans as their saviors. No matter how modest our ability to protect birds from windows has been, for the past 4 decades, progress over the past several years has been rapid, inspiring, and uplifting. There's still much to do. Ignoring the problem will not make it go away. We have the ability to fix it, but we still need the collective will. The birds will need and deserve a solution. They have no voice or means to protect themselves. We're their only hope, and I'm confident we will make our windows safe for birds because it's the right thing to do. And with that, I hope I've stayed within my time, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
What is a UV signal on a window?
Okay. It's a pattern similar to any visible pattern that might be put on a window, only it's applied with ultraviolet reflecting elements. So picture a line or picture a dot that reflects ultraviolet from about 300 to 400 nanometers, which is not typically visible to us, but falls within the range of most birds. We've learned this, interestingly enough. I mean, I knew about this from about 1979 when it was first published in the journal Science that birds could see ultraviolet. But frankly, every time a glass manufacturer produces a sheet of glass, they put a coating on there to absorb the ultraviolet. And as we all know, living things have to see reflections. They can't see absorbing. So it took until the early 2000s before I was able to enjoy the benefit of a manufacturer who could produce an ultraviolet signal for testing. And at least in my initial studies and my published works, I've documented its effectiveness.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to now call up Christine Shepard for her presentation. Are you there, Christine? Christine is the director of American Bird Conservancy's Glass Collisions program. She has been since its inception in 2009. She earned a PhD from Cornell University and has worked as the head of the ornithology department at the Bronx Zoo. Christine, welcome.
Thank you. As usual, Dan and I agree on everything, so he's already said almost everything that I'm planning to say. I just got to. Sorry, I can't get rid of the menu, which is covering the slideshow clicker. Come on. I really don't understand what is going on. All right, I'm just going to have to run through it like this.
Right, please, Christine, the last button, you have on the bottom of your screen, there is a slider, and on the left of the slider, there is a kind of screen to share, a very small icon. Yes, on the left, no.
Oh.
On the left? Okay, no. you are almost there. So there is another icon on the left of the slider.
Christine, on your right, go to the right. Yes, a little left. Go left, a little. Yes.
Yes, there.
Yeah. Here you go.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
All right, that was an unusual problem. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is problems. So that makes sense. I'm really excited to be part of this conference. Thank you, Helena, for inviting me. It's wonderful to actually be able to see some of the people that I've been corresponding with, and I've been reading their work. As Dan said, he kicked something off almost 50 years ago. And since then, more and more people have been trying to address this problem of mortality from collisions. In 2014, the Smithsonian published a meta-analysis. They took data from monitoring programs, from museums, anywhere they could get information. And on the basis of that analysis, they determined that 300 million to 1 billion birds were being killed by collisions in the US every year. Since that time, we feel that the true number is closer to 1 billion because the data they used was taken before 2012. We've since discovered that monitors are less effective at finding carcasses than we believed. And because there's so much more glass in the built environment than there was. Really, it's also important to think about glass, and as long as we're here talking about it, cats, as aspects of habitat degradation. You often see a list that says, which do you think is more of a problem? Habitat loss, glass, cats. Well, those are all part of habitat. It shouldn't be a distinction. What types of birds are killed? Well, we have a pretty good handle on that. There's a lot of information coming from Latin America. There's an increasing amount of information that's been coming out of Asia. And we know that almost any kind of bird can be killed by a collision, but the small passerines that migrate at night tend to be a particular risk. And this has been particularly well documented in North America. Why don't we see carcasses? If there's 1 billion birds out there, why isn't the world littered with carcasses? Well, as Dan said, birds can fly away and to be injured and die later. Birds can die on impact and bounce into plantings. But primarily, this is an issue of scavengers. Scavengers value little pretty packages of protein and fat, and they will actually stake out particularly good windows. So there's nothing there to tell the random person that this is a problem. They look around and they say, well, why is this a problem? I'm not seeing dead birds everywhere. And this is a long-term issue. Everybody has seen or heard a bird hit a window, and almost everybody, except probably the people logged in here, think that it's a rare event. We have to help people understand that there are many, many, many more collisions than that. Now, the Smithsonian paper looked at where on buildings birds are colliding. Almost 50% of birds collide with windows on buildings that are 3 stories or less. So that means most private homes, it means small sheds, small buildings. Almost all of the rest of the birds hit buildings that are 11 stories or less, so low-rise buildings. Now, this doesn't mean birds don't run into skyscrapers. They do, but there are many, many fewer skyscrapers. And on skyscrapers, most of the collisions take place within about 100 feet of the ground. This is actually something that was shown in one of Dan's early papers, actually more recent than that, 2009, that the strongest correlation between glass and collision numbers is whether or not the glass reflects vegetation. And you can think about this, the same way you hear that most car accidents take place within 20 miles of home. Well, that's because that's where you do most of your driving. Birds tend to be found in vegetation. Vegetation gives them shelter, it gives them food, and when they're in vegetation, they may well be attracted to reflections of vegetation, and that's when collisions occur. When do collisions occur? Well, we've learned a lot about that too. In fact, most collisions take place during the day. There's a misunderstanding where people think that birds are flying at night into skyscrapers. And this came about because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you found situations where you had a tall, brightly lit building. And so it was bright, surrounded by darkness. There were mass kill events, which have really gone into myth. So that's what people always think of immediately when they think about bird collisions. That's not the typical case of a collision. Typically, birds have to forage during the day, especially if you're talking about migrants. When the sun comes up, they're flying around and they find vegetation and they find reflected vegetation, and that's the typical pattern. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the 9/11 memorial in lights, and it is still bright enough in New York City to attract birds and cause them to circle in place. Luckily for all these birds, New York City Audubon stays up all night whenever this memorial is lit. And if birds are trapped in the light beams, as you see here, they make a call and the lights are turned off for 5 minutes. That releases the birds. That's all you have to do if there's a lighting problem. But we see this rarely. Unfortunately, it's the kind of event that gets publicity. There was a mass kill at the World Trade Center a couple of weeks ago. That got a lot of publicity. But there are many, many, many birds killed at the World Trade Center on an average day over the season. And the problem here is light pollution. We don't see lots of birds attracted to a single place because there are hardly any places where bright lights are surrounded by darkness anymore. But we also know and are getting more and more research verifying that birds are sucked into the built environment by lights. If they're coming down from migration, they head towards the lights. They don't head towards the parks where you'd like them to go because there's no glass there. And once they've come down, they're found in higher numbers in areas where there are lights than would be true if you found them at random. And that's when in the morning birds start colliding with glass. It actually helps a bit to understand how birds see the world, because it's quite different from the way we do. Primates, including humans, have flat faces. Our eyes are close together. We see almost the same thing with each eye. We don't have anything sticking out between our eyes. So we have good depth perception, and we tend to perceive the world as something that is in front of us, that we're walking into. Now, birds have a different view of the world. I don't know if you guys are seeing that. Sorry. Birds have eyes on opposite sides of their heads. And I mean, imagine not seeing the same thing with each eye. It would be really a very, very different sensation. Birds do have some depth perception, but they use other strategies to tell how fast they're flying, when they're going to reach their destination. Some of their most acute vision is actually out to the side. They're not looking where they're going. Birds presumably perceive the world as something that they're immersed in, and what's to the side and behind them can be more important than what's in front of them. As Dan said, some birds see ultraviolet, not all birds do, but in general, birds see many more colors than humans do. Birds can perceive the magnetic field of the Earth, although it's unlikely that that is the navigational sense they use as they come down after they've been migrating. It's more likely that ground level lights are simply blinding their dim adapted eyeballs. The one area where human vision is actually better than bird vision is contrast sensitivity. I don't know if you've ever seen a chart like this one on the bottom right. You have better contrast sensitivity if you can distinguish between smaller and smaller lines. What it boils down to is that humans can distinguish between, say, two dots at a longer distance than birds can. And what that means is that it's very difficult to produce signals that birds will see and avoid that people won't see. That, of course, is sort of the magic thing that everybody's hoping for. This is what I mean by cluttered and uncluttered environments. If birds are flying in an uncluttered environment, an open environment, which actually has, say, a building that's reflecting sky in it, we need to draw their attention to that reflective glass and make them believe that it's a cluttered environment, that they need to travel around it to be safe. My model of a bird flying through what it believes to be an open environment is actually a kid texting on a skateboard, but I've never been fast enough to get my camera up to get a video. But you can see, like a bird, this gentleman is not paying attention to where he's going. And he is very likely to run into something that he's not expecting if he goes much farther than this. As Dan said, people think that they can see glass, but they really can't. But people can learn the concept of glass as a transparent barrier that can also be something that reflects the local habitat. Because people can understand this concept, you can put a row of decals like this on glass, and people will know that that's a glass door or a glass wall. For birds, a row of decals like that is simply something they could fly above or fly below. They don't understand. And if I take away the cues that you use to learn where glass is, you can't tell me if this is a picture of a tree, if this is the reflection of a tree, or if it's a tree that's seen through clear glass. When I give you more information, you know that glass has to be involved. You can see the crack, you can see the mountains, but it's only when I give you this much information that you know that there's glass there, that's a reflective piece of glass. Birds don't understand that right angles are not natural. they don't understand that you don't see the tops of trees without the bottoms of trees. Birds cannot respond to the kinds of cues that tell people where glass is. And that's another reason that birds collide in such big numbers. Birds take what they see literally, and that's deadly. Or they think that they can fly between multiple layers of glass. It's unfortunate. This is a very good example in Manhattan on 42nd Street. There are more trees inside this atrium than there are for several blocks outside. So birds in the area tend to be drawn to these windows, and they can see the plants through them, and they collide with them. People often used to think that, well, in the US, maybe north and south would be the most dangerous parts of buildings because of the association with migration. Dan's work, among others, has shown that it doesn't matter what direction the glass is facing. Again, what matters is really whether or not the glass reflects vegetation. You can see that, you know, it'd be very easy to believe that this reflection here was real habitat. We've learned that birds will follow pathways designed for humans, and they can be on a small scale like this. They can be caused by landscape features funneling birds that are migrating across a broad front into a narrow area. So these are things that we can look for when we're trying to solve an existing problem, or there are things that we can try not to design if we're creating new landscapes. And there's been a lot of interest in green roofs recently. And New York City now has enough experience with green roofs that it's been demonstrated that green roofs produce food that birds can use. They produce shelter that birds can use. And even for some species, they're producing nesting habitat. The only thing that you have to be aware of is that the green roof can also attract birds near to glass that they might not otherwise come in contact with. So we have to sort of think of these things at the same time. Basically, and I keep saying this, as Dan said, we know how to stop collisions. You could use visual markers, you space them 5 centimeters apart, and it basically signals to the bird that the space is too small for them to fly through. If you can make the window safe for small birds, it works for big birds. So we know how to do it, and we can do it using markers that obscure less than 1% of the glass surface. We're not asking people to give up their ability to see through glass. Designers have made some bird-friendly buildings that are 100% glass. So our problem is human behavior. People like shiny buildings like this. They think it's really interesting, you know, that this glass reflects the sky. The majority of people are really unaware of the magnitude of a collision issue. As I said, they're not seeing the ground paved with birds. They've seen a bird hit a window, but they think this is something rare. So our focus, you know, to a large extent has to be with educating people. It's almost the only conservation issue where an individual person can learn something and go home and do something about it the same day. People can go home and put Post-it notes up on the outside of their windows. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. And we're seeing more and more solutions. Glass companies are starting to buy into this. Legislation is starting to require it. So what ABC has been doing, we have, on the left, you see what I call a flyer. It's a one page with writing on both sides of it. The front is just a simple summation of the problem. And on the back are links to all the different types of retrofit solutions that are out there. So, you know, if you want tape or decals or netting or an Acopian bird saver, the links are back there. The publication on the right, Bird Friendly Building Design, both of these can be downloaded as PDFs. Is a more technical publication, so it's intended more for architects and designers and so forth. But it has a lot of information, and it can actually help convince people that this is a real problem. This is a screenshot of the menu for ABC's new website for collisions. So we have a whole section on architecture and planning. We have a section on legislation. So we have summarized or collected all of the legislation that we've been able to, primarily in the US and Canada. We've got links, we've got the text, and we've also rated the legislation based on how likely it is to actually do a good job of reducing collisions. And we discussed that at great length because there's a lot of legislation out there that does not actually do what you would hope it does. We have a searchable database.
We're running out of time here.
This is my last slide.
Okay, wonderful.
And so you can look at products and solutions. You can see our glass evaluation program. Lots of resources you can download, and we have a gallery of examples that you can take a look at. So thank you. It's been an honor to talk to you tonight, and I will turn it back over to the moderator.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and we've got already several questions, which I will ask you after Augusto makes the last presentation right now, okay? I'm going to introduce now Augusto Piratelli in Português. Augusto é o biólogo com doutorado em zoologia da Unesp e Rio Claro, e fez postdoctoral work, e fez um estudo pós-doutoral na Universidade de Missouri. Ele foi editor-chefe da Revista Brasileira de Ornitologia e editor associado da revista Biota Neotrópica. Atualmente é professor titular e chefe de departamento de Ciências Ambientais da UFS-CAR em Sorocaba. Augusto, você está aí? Opa, estou vendo você.
Estou aqui.
Tudo bom?
Tudo bem. Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Vou compartilhando a minha tela aqui para começarmos. Inicialmente, eu agradeço ao convite, agradeço a todos. É uma honra estar participando desse evento e é uma grande responsabilidade estar aqui falando logo depois do Dr. Daniel Klein e Dr. Christine Shepard. E, bem, eu vou começar a minha apresentação com uma frase. Eu vou tentar cumprir o desafio que a Helena me delegou. Vamos ver se eu consigo fazer o possível, né? Eu vou falar em português, ok? Bom, eu começo com essa frase que a gente vê em muitos trabalhos científicos, dizendo que milhões de aves no mundo morrem vítimas de colisões em estruturas de vidro, o que, de fato, é uma grande realidade. Mas eu fiquei me perguntando, será que esse no mundo inclui a América Latina e o Brasil? O quanto nós estamos representados nessas estatísticas? E baseado em experiências pessoais de ver aves, então, chocando-se com janelas e a maioria delas morrendo, eu comecei a fazer, eu e o meu grupo começamos a fazer alguns trabalhos, iniciamos com uma revisão das principais causas de colisões de aves na literatura científica, usando os indicadores baseados em Web of Science e outros indexadores de revistas de mais alto impacto. E nessa busca, nós achamos uma quantidade restrita de trabalhos produzidos no Brasil. Apenas 3 trabalhos, então, apareceram nos meus indexadores, usando as minhas palavras-chave, e, de fato, a maioria dos estudos que nós conhecemos vem dos Estados Unidos e Canadá. E uma coisa interessante que também nós conseguimos perceber é que esse trabalho e outros trabalhos nossos também, além da repercussão em literatura científica. Ele ganhou também alguma repercussão em redes sociais, ele foi tweetado várias vezes, e chamou minha atenção que a grande maioria desses twitters são da América do Norte. Sabemos que tem alguns vieses nisso, porque primeiro trabalho escrito em língua inglesa, e depois talvez a maior parte dos usuários do Twitter não são brasileiros. E, bom, seguimos então buscando agora informações, mais especificamente no Brasil. É uma pergunta interessante, difícil de responder, como é que a gente vai obter essas informações? Eu não conseguiria, certamente, obter todas essas informações para trazer aqui nessa apresentação, e, portanto, eu usei a minha experiência na academia, sou professor de uma universidade federal, brasileira, pública, e decidi, então, procurar palavras-chave em português para ver o que a gente conseguiria, inicialmente, na literatura científica em português. Eu coloquei algumas palavras, colisões de aves e vidraças, entre aspas, eu coloquei essa frase, sem filtro temporal, encontrei apenas 3 trabalhos, então, usando essa categoria de palavras-chave. Posteriormente, eu tirei as aspas, eu procurei essas palavras, aves, colisões e vidraças, sem aspas, a qualquer momento também, sem filtro temporal, e encontrei uma quantidade um pouquinho maior de trabalhos. Eu acabei validando 7 trabalhos, porque da 5ª página em diante, todos os trabalhos que eu encontrei não tinham a relação com o que eu estava buscando, que era produzir uma lista de espécies, então, reportadas como colididas em vidraças no Brasil. Depois eu tornei a procurar alguns termos em inglês, para ver o que a gente conseguia encontrar do Brasil. Usei essa frase, bird window collisions, e encontrei muitas páginas, muitas coisas, mas, na verdade, no final das contas, eu tive só um trabalho, que foi um dos trabalhos nosso, sem ter duplicação de dados. Analisando esses dados, eu encontrei que a maioria dos trabalhos publicados, ou que a gente encontra, então, no Google acadêmico no Brasil, estão publicados em periódicos indexados, a maioria em português, mas alguns em inglês, trabalhos de conclusão de cursos de graduação, artigos em periódicos não indexados, simpósios, dissertações de mestrado e também um estudo técnico. Eu não incluí aqui um artigo, o que acrescentaria aqui em artigos em periódicos, eu tive acesso a ele ontem, ele acabou de ser publicado, ele foi feito também em Curitiba, na região sul do Brasil, mas acabou não entrando aqui nas minhas estatísticas. Aonde estão esses trabalhos? A seguir, eu fiz um mapeamento da representatividade desses trabalhos no país. Eu achei, como forma esperada, a maior parte desses estudos estão nas regiões sul e sudeste do Brasil. Porém, eu tenho um reporte de Manaus, na Amazônia, e tenho um reporte no Cerrado, no Distrito Federal. Mas eu encontrei, então, a maior parte desses trabalhos desenvolvidos em campos universitários, inclusive o nosso aqui em Sorocaba, e alguns trabalhos em áreas protegidas também. Desses trabalhos, eu encontrei, ao final das contas, 190 casos de colisões no Brasil, que não haviam sido, então, reunidos, representados, então, 141 espécies de aves diferentes de 34 famílias. As famílias mais abundantes, então, reportadas são as pombas, né, os columbide, e os sanhaços, os traupide. Apesar da maioria das espécies não estarem ameaçadas de extinção, conforme lista da IUCN, eu encontrei algumas espécies vulneráveis e algumas espécies também quase ameaçadas, e isso, conforme foi até dito no começo desse simpósio, né, a sensibilização das pessoas, não importa quais são as espécies, ressalta a importância da gente estar aqui discutindo esses trabalhos, esse tipo de problema. Bom, nesse nosso levantamento, então, nós encontramos alguns trabalhos nossos, obviamente, eu vou falar um pouquinho mais deles, e talvez diferente da América do Norte, nós ainda estamos um pouquinho atrás em algumas coisas que talvez já estejam consolidadas, mas que eu achei importante a gente consolidar isso também no Brasil, usando, então, a situação ambiental, a problemática local, para ver se realmente as coisas coincidiam. Bom, inicialmente, nós decidimos testar se essas silhuetas de aves de rapina realmente funcionavam como medidas preventivas, porque eu vejo constantemente residências ou prédios públicos usando, então, essas aves de rapina, essas silhuetas, como no intuito de que isso resolvesse a situação de evitar as colisões. E nós, então, no nosso campus universitário aqui em Sorocaba, nós fomos testar isso cientificamente. Nós desenvolvemos um protocolo, adesivamos aqui algumas vidraças de alguns prédios do nosso campus, e aqui vocês veem, então, uma foto de alguns vidros aqui adesivados, e aqui embaixo nós podemos ver alguns vidros que não estão adesivados. E depois de um certo tempo, nós comparamos os resultados, e encontramos que, embora esses adesivos, de fato, possam diminuir a quantidade de colisões, mas essa diferença, na verdade, estatisticamente, ela não existiu, porque não houve essa diferença. Então, nós concluímos que esses adesivos, eles não são muito adequados, e que a gente deveria pensar, então, em partir para adesivos que realmente, ou adesivos, ou qualquer tipo de medida preventiva que efetivamente evitasse as colisões. E nesse intuito, nós passamos a testar um segundo tipo de adesivo, que são os adesivos circulares. E a partir daí, esse artigo ele teve bastante repercussão, ele foi bastante acessado na literatura científica, ele também foi tweetado algumas vezes, ele teve uma repercussão boa, nós estamos até satisfeitos com essa repercussão. Também desenvolvido no mesmo local, no nosso campus, em Sorocaba. A vantagem desse tipo de adesivo é que ele pode ser feito manualmente. Aqui está, então, a minha amiga e bióloga Bianca Ribeiro, enquanto estudante ainda de biologia, colando aqui alguns adesivos. A vantagem desses adesivos é que eles podem ser feitos em pequena escala. Então, o proprietário rural ou o proprietário de sua residência, vários já nos procuraram relatando o problema. A gente sugeriu esse tipo de adesivo, e o pessoal tem falado que realmente isso funciona, sabendo que existem diversas outras medidas tão efetivas quantas, mas nós testamos e sugerimos essa. Tem muito a ver, talvez, conforme os professores que me precederam falaram, o distanciamento entre as marcas, não é? As aves precisam enxergar que ali existe algum anteparo, não importa se são bolinhas, se são círculos ou se são listas, mas o anteparo precisa existir. Esse anteparo também tem que ser visualmente atraente para as pessoas, não é? Senão as pessoas vão ter bastante restrição em usar esses anteparos. Então, a gente precisa pensar em tudo isso. Bom, um dos resultados importantes do nosso trabalho é que as vidraças nas quais nós aplicamos esses adesivos, o número de colisões zerou, não tivemos nenhum reporte de colisão, diferente daquelas vidraças sem nenhum tipo de anteparo ou com as aves de rapina. Esse trabalho ganhou também repercussão na mídia, ele foi publicado aqui num jornal online, a gente deu entrevista para esse jornal e divulgou então, esse trabalho. Então, esse trabalho, na nossa opinião, esse tipo de pesquisa, então, quando ganha mídia, quando ganha redes sociais, eu posso entender que o público, o grande público, além aqui da universidade, está começando, então, também a ter acesso e a entender melhor esse problema e a perceber que, na verdade, ninguém está sozinho. No Brasil, basicamente, essas informações estão bastante difusas. Eu acabei, o próximo passo justamente foi pesquisar usando o Google, não o Google acadêmico, mas o Google, eu coloquei essas palavras em português, colisões de aves e vidraça, para ver o que aparecia no Google. E achei bastante coisa, existe uma quantidade grande de informações, na verdade, em português, desenvolvida, então, por pessoas dos diversas partes do país e de diversas origens. E nós encontramos, então, aqui eu tive, como eu falei no começo da apresentação, eu me restringi mais à academia, ao que a gente tem de literatura científica, porque eu acho que, como pesquisador, a gente precisa prover também essas informações científicas para ajudar, então, e ser ajudado pelo grande público a resolver esse grande problema ambiental que tem matado, de fato, milhões de aves no mundo todo, incluindo aqui no Brasil. Então, eu entendo que esses dados que eu coletei são somente a ponta do iceberg, a ponta do problema. Eu tenho certeza que isso é muito maior do que isso. Eu conheço várias iniciativas que têm registrado, que têm feito essa compilação com critérios bastante corretos e bastante ordenados, e que estão gerando também informações muito importantes para trazer à tona esse conhecimento, esse problema tão grave no Brasil. Eu também encontrei, na minha busca, um artigo publicado num jornal local, aqui em Sorocaba, e nesse artigo eu fazia uma relação de um desenho animado que no meu tempo de criança era muito famoso, sobre uma família que vivia no futuro em cidades aéreas como essas, e a gente não via, e a gente via muitas estruturas de vidro aqui. Eu fiquei pensando como seriam as aves do futuro, como é que elas aprenderiam a lidar com isso, o que aconteceria com as aves migratórias num tipo de cidade como essa, convivendo com esses prédios altíssimos, cheios de vidro e com carros voadores. Eu acho que a gente não pode caminhar, então, para esse tipo de cidade. Felizmente, eu acho que isso já está sendo reavaliado, e as cidades do futuro não podem caminhar para esse modelo urbanístico que a gente via aqui nos desenhos animados quando a gente era criança. Bom, existem, eu acho que, diversas fronteiras a serem investigadas no Brasil, a serem discutidas, seriam analisar os fatores intrínsecos inerentes às aves, os fatores ambientais do entorno que potencializam, então, as colisões de aves e vidraças. No momento que a gente passa a entender essas questões com a experiência de cada um de nós, não é? Aí entra a experiência de cada um, as pessoas que percebem lá o bichinho morto, que percebem que aquela vidraça realmente pode trazer um problema, e que está colocando esse problema para discussão, né, que as pessoas estão mais sensibilizadas sobre isso atualmente, e eu deveria aproveitar, eu acho que isso vai ser bastante, nós vamos ter uma discussão mais profunda sobre isso, sobre essa questão de envolver as pessoas, de conduzir, então, as políticas públicas, mas, acima de tudo, eu acho que nós já perdemos muito tempo, é o momento da gente rigorosamente discutir políticas públicas adequadas, voltadas, então, a evitar que esses acidentes ocorram com tanta frequência, e a dilapidação da segunda maior diversidade de aves do mundo, que é a biodiversidade brasileira de aves. Então, a gente precisa entender que essas aves estão desempenhando inúmeros serviços ecossistêmicos, e a dilapidação desse patrimônio natural certamente está dilapidando a nossa qualidade de vida também. Finalmente, eu gostaria de anunciar, muitos já sabem, são até colaboradores, estamos produzindo um data paper sobre colisões de aves na América Latina. Nós temos dados, eu não posso divulgar esses dados, até porque a maioria dos dados são de colaboradores, não são meus, enquanto eles não estão publicados. Nós temos mais de 500 espécies reportadas em 11 países da América Latina, mais de 100 colaboradores nos enviaram seus dados, então, em breve, a gente espera estar divulgando amplamente isso, para que realmente a gente tenha um cenário mais transparente e mais visível aqui na América Latina. Finalmente, eu gostaria de agradecer o Dr. Daniel Klein e a Dr. Christine Shepard for having inspired me nas minhas pesquisas, e também agradecer a Helena Baques, desculpe, Helena, e a Bianca Ribeiro por terem me convidado para poder estar aqui participando nesse evento tão importante, talvez o maior evento já realizado no Brasil sobre esse assunto. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, professor. Estão me ouvindo?
Sim, estou tentando.
Professor, já temos... Bom, então agora nós vamos ter uma sessão de perguntas para todos os três. Eu vou começar com você, professor Augusto. Okay, I'm going to start just by... I've got Augusto right here on the line, and I want to ask him a couple of questions. A primeira pergunta é minha, na verdade, e talvez seja uma tentativa de extrair de você apenas um cheiro dessa pesquisa que você anunciou agora, tão interessante, ainda secreto, mas nós temos uma ideia se o tamanho do problema. Nós vimos que tem algo em torno de 1 bilhão de aves mortos na América do Norte, por ano, pelo que eu entendi. O tamanho do problema na América do Sul é semelhante? Nós sabemos disso?
Eu acredito que um grande problema na América do Sul, ou pelo menos eu posso dizer no Brasil, é justamente que as informações estão bastante pulverizadas. Nós temos relatos esporádicos em diversas partes, mas ainda essas informações um tanto pulverizadas que nos impedem ainda de avaliar se realmente o problema aqui no Brasil é do mesmo porte do problema na América do Norte, mas eu arrisco a dizer que sim, principalmente se a gente considerar a nossa biodiversidade, a quantidade de espécies de aves que existem no Brasil, a abundância populacional de várias delas, sobretudo aquelas que vieram a viver no ambiente urbano, ou no meio rural, ali na periferia das cidades, onde existem, então, habitações humanas, e também uma grande tendência aí das construções mais recentes usarem muito estruturas de vidro. Eu acredito que tudo isso esteja potencializando para aumentar esse problema. Então, eu diria que o tamanho da encrenca aqui no Brasil realmente deva atingir cifras assustadoras. Eu imagino que tão quanto lá as cifras que os colegas reportaram para a América do Norte.
Muito obrigado. I'm going to ask questions of is everyone on? Can everyone get online? I think that's the idea, right? Professor Daniel and Professor Christine. I've got a question here that any one of you can, I think, could answer or might want to answer. And it was made in Portuguese. I'm going to translate it. And it's asking if this question is being discussed in engineering and architectural schools. Because what we seem to see are more and more big glass buildings. And that would seem to be the wrong direction in terms of bird safety. Is this being discussed in architectural schools?
Only if someone like me or Dan comes and offers to do a presentation. ABC has a continuing education class for architects that we use. And we've probably reached, thousands of architects anyway. But it's beyond architects. Sometimes they want to build a bird-friendly building and the client doesn't want to. So we have to reach everybody, unfortunately.
Okay. Other people would like to know where they can get the stickers or the UV stickers to put on the buildings, on the windows. Anyone?
You can go, if you just go on Amazon, Augusto, why don't you talk, because they want the ones that you used.
May I speak in Portuguese? Do you mind? Translation? Ok.
Sim, eu acho que tem tradução.
Ok.
There is translation, yes.
Existe, como professora Shepard falou, você pode encontrar na internet diversos modelos, como aves de rapina, inclusive aves de rapina, mas você pode encontrar diversos modelos que você pode, inclusive, aplicar em grandes escalas. Existem indústrias nacionais também já fazendo isso, já comercializando esse tipo de adesivo, e também existe uma discussão sobre o tipo de vidro a ser utilizado nas vidraças aqui no Brasil.
Okay. I've got another question here, which is, I'd like to know the name of the UV deterrent here in the US, so I will know what to look for online. Thank you.
Okay, I can offer a few things. First of all, there's unfortunately no UV deterrent for retrofitting buildings. This has to come from a film, and there was a company which I worked with that produced a very effective film, but because of their own internal inability to assess how much they would get in return on their investment, they've refused to make the film. Other film companies have been trying to convince them to sell their product or give them the answer to how to produce their films, but unsuccessful so far. So as far as retrofitting goes, and of course the whole world has to be retrofitted, the UV signal issue, which I always refer to as the elegant solution because birds see it and we don't, and that would provide us with the opportunity to keep away from having any kind of visual noise on the windows. There are a couple of companies that sell products that have a UV signal for remodeling and new construction. Two of the glass manufacturers in North America are Walker Glass in Montreal, Quebec, and Guardian Glass in Michigan. Of course, Guardian Glass has, I'm sure, a plant in Brazil. They have them on every continent except Antarctica and Australia. They're a very large company, and they've invested in producing a bird-safe glass that has a signal. In all these cases, though, the best level of measured deterrence from these signals are around 70% reduction of a risk of a strike. So we're not talking about the kinds of effects we can get with those patterns that are visible to humans and birds. They can reach into the 90s to 100% effective with the 2x4 rule or the 2x2 rule. So I always describe the UV issue as still a work in process. I haven't given it up. I think it's worthy of continued investigation, and we just have to work with our materials engineers to craft a patterning that provides the greatest amount of strength in the UV signal and as high a contrast as possible, where the reflection and the absorption elements are adjacent to one another. These are at least the elements that have proven to be effective in my studies so far.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I've been asked to introduce Ilza Fujiyama. Ilza, are you there? Did I pronounce your name correctly? Eu falei seu nome certo, Ilza?
Sim, falou sim.
Oh, muito obrigado. Oh, ótimo. Então, eu acho que está com você agora.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Good evening. Primeiramente, eu quero agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui participando deste evento. E eu posso dizer, inicialmente, que eu estou muito emocionada de estar aqui, juntamente com as pessoas que embasaram as minhas pesquisas, Dr. Daniel Klein, Christine Scheppen, o professor Augusto Piratelli. Todos eles me atenderam prontamente quando eu comecei a fazer a pesquisa sobre essa questão, que até então eu não tinha ideia da dimensão, da quantidade de aves que morriam por colisões em vidraças. Então, obrigada a todos por essa oportunidade. Então, assim, eu fiz a minha pesquisa para a conclusão do meu TCC aqui na Universidade de Brasília, e quando eu comecei a pesquisar o tema, conforme eu falei inicialmente, eu não tinha ideia da dimensão da problemática, né? Então, aqui em Brasília, uma cidade jovem, né, tem 60 anos, e eu tenho observado que a arquitetura está cada vez mais envidraçada. Os prédios que surgem dia a dia são todos em vidros reflexivos, os vidros espelhados. E eu, conversando com o orientador, nós resolvemos fazer, então, a pesquisa sobre a mortandade de aves, uma vez que eu sempre estava vendo aves se chocando nas vidraças, seja do meu condomínio, ou no condomínio vizinho, ou até na própria UNB. E aí nós começamos a fazer o levantamento, e encontrei, inclusive, o trabalho do professor Piratelli, e até entrei em contato com ele na ocasião para saber como estavam essas pesquisas. A Universidade de Brasília, a maioria dos prédios são baixos. Nós não temos muitos prédios altos lá. Então, o que a gente pensa? Que a maioria das colisões acontecem em estruturas altas, o que acabou por comprovar nas nossas pesquisas e nas leituras que nós tivemos aí, que não é a altura das construções, não são fatores decisivos para as colisões. Então, nós fizemos a pesquisa, e o que nós observamos é que as colisões em vidraças são assuntos que a maioria da população desconhece. Nas nossas pesquisas, 60% dos entrevistados não sabiam, não tinham conhecimento que existia esse tipo de acidentes, que as aves colidiam em vidraças. Então, nós resolvemos implantar no campus da UNB 2 métodos mitigadores para comprovar a eficácia, mesmo que o professor Piratelli já tenha feito na UFSCar. Nós resolvemos implantar aqui em Brasília, porque aqui nós temos o cerrado, as aves são diferentes, e o bioma cerrado está entre um dos mais biodiversos do mundo, com muita riqueza. E nós selecionamos alguns prédios do campus para a gente poder fazer esse nosso experimento. Pegamos um prédio que tinha os vidros transparentes e também escolhemos um outro prédio que tem os vidros espelhados. E nós implantamos 2 métodos nesses 2 prédios. Sendo que esses prédios que nós escolhemos para nossas pesquisas, para o nosso experimento, eles foram os prédios que haviam mais colisões de aves durante o nosso período de monitoramento. Então, nós aplicamos em um dos prédios com os vidros transparentes os adesivos circulares, né? Colocamos os adesivos de 1,9 centímetro de diâmetros, seguimos o padrão científico com distanciamento entre um e outro de 10 centímetros, e também utilizamos um outro método que foram os American Bird Savers, que são as cortinas de vento, conhecida aqui no Brasil, que são aquelas cordinhas que você coloca ela na posição vertical, e também colocamos com distanciamento entre um e outro de 10 centímetros, entre uma cordinha e outra. Depois que nós colocamos esses 2 experimentos, nós podemos corroborar, né, que esses métodos, eles evitam as colisões. Desde que nós implantamos, não houve mais colisões nesses prédios que a gente instalou esses métodos. E, com isso, a Universidade de Brasília, ela pretende levar esse experimento para os outros prédios do campus, e nas próximas construções, eles já querem adotar vidros que não tragam essa reflexão, que não tragam a continuidade do ambiente para as aves. Porque quando você tem a vegetação refletida nesses vidros, é que vem ocasionar essas colisões. Porque, como a doutora Shepard citou, as aves, elas têm uma visão diferente da nossa, elas não enxergam como nós humanos enxergamos. Então, por isso a importância de sinalizarmos para elas que há algo ali na frente delas. Porque hoje eu tenho um ambiente que não tem nada, que não tem um prédio, e as aves estão voando, circulando livremente. De um dia para o outro, surgem prédios que as aves, pelo menos as aves migratórias, não estavam acostumadas, e elas vêm e colidem com com essas estruturas. Então, assim, só corroborando, os métodos que nós implantamos na Universidade de Brasília está trazendo uma eficácia. Desde que implantamos, não houve colisões de aves mais nesses prédios. E, assim, importante destacar, já estou quase finalizando, né?
Okay.
Importante destacar que nós temos, por exemplo, a ABNT e a NBR 7199, que a gente vai tratar mais para frente, acho que no próximo painel de amanhã, né, que é a lei que regulamenta a utilização de vidros. Né? Então, seria, de repente, amanhã a gente pode estar, de repente, continuando esse tema, que eu tenho pouco tempo aqui agora, mas o que eu queria dizer é o seguinte, para nós pensarmos na sustentabilidade de uma forma diferenciada. Hoje, quando se pensa em sustentabilidade, em uma construção sustentável, se pensa numa construção mais voltada para o lado socioeconômico. Então, assim, para as pessoas, engenheiros, arquitetos, nossos legisladores que estão aqui presentes hoje conosco, que nós devemos pensar na sustentabilidade com um pilar diferenciado, não só o pilar sócio e da economia, mas com o pilar da natureza, do meio ambiente, focado para outros seres que estão aqui, porque nós não somos os únicos seres viventes aqui nesse planeta. Então, quando a gente vai construir, quando a gente vai pensar, idealizar uma construção, poder ter esse olhar mais crítico e pensar quem vai estar circulando por aqui, quais outros seres vão estar sendo beneficiados ou prejudicados por essa construção, por esse tipo de vidro que eu vou estar colocando aqui.
Ok.
Só para finalizar, eu criei um videozinho com passo a passo de como você colocar os adesivos nas suas janelas, se você quer mitigar esses impactos a baixo custo. E é bem fácil de você estar implantando. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank everyone, Professor Piratelli, Ilza, Professor Daniel, Clem, Professor Christine, and Elena, would you like to introduce tomorrow's session?
In fact, I would like to introduce today's section.
Oh, there's another one today.
There's
Okay.
another one today, yeah. So we are going to have a short break. Some questions we are not able to answer, so I will switch to Portuguese. A gente não teve tempo de responder todas as perguntas, teve ainda gente com mão levantada que a gente não conseguiu atender. Se os palestrantes deixarem contato e quiserem mandar perguntas direto, a gente vai ter ainda mais tempo para tentar responder, especialmente essa questão dos materiais e das soluções é o tema do próximo painel. Então, a gente pode deixar bastante perguntas sobre esse tema específico para ser respondidas pelos nossos próximos painelistas, e a gente volta a se encontrar aqui daqui menos de 10 minutos, 19h40, a gente está começando a próxima sessão, que vai tratar das soluções.
Ok, muito obrigado, e até daqui a pouquinho.
Obrigada a todos. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Augusto. It was a pleasure. Really nice job. Thank you, Matthew.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Elena, are we finished?
Yes, Daniel, thank you so much. We are having a short break, and then we are starting the next panel. Stefan Knust and Michael Measure are going to be the panelists, and we have representative of the Garden Glass in Brazil that she will talk about and show some examples for the buildings that we have in Brazil that already are bird friendly, and some and talk about the glass techniques for the terrace. So I think if you still keep with us, it will be nice.
Okay. So
Thank you.
We're authorized to stay on. We can stay.
Of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Ready to go?
Certainly. Yeah.
Ok. Então, vamos dar início ao segundo bloco, que parte, claro, como esperado, a gente já avançou um pouquinho no primeiro bloco, porque as pessoas querem saber o que vão fazer para evitar as colisões. Então, a gente tem aqui um time de peso, que vai ser conduzido pelo Bernardo, que é arquiteto, e ele ajudou a traduzir o guia da ABC, junto com o pessoal da Ecoaves de Minas, e começou a se familiarizar com esse assunto, e que agora vai ser nosso parceiro para divulgar entre arquitetos e a gente, de repente, tratar de uma nova estética para as construções em que o vidro ou não seja tão preponderante ou seja tratado de uma forma que fique amigo das aves. So, thank you, Michael and Stefan, for joining us in this second panel. I don't know if you have listened to the first one, but the focus of this panel about the solutions to solve the problem, we have already, people try already to cover in the first one because everybody asked about that. So you have the task to help people to find out what is available in materials and designs to solve the problem. And then Betania will share some insights of Guardian Glass, the experience in Brazil. Obrigada, Betânia, pelo patrocínio da Guardian Glass e porque eu sei que você vai apresentar algumas das soluções de prédios que são amigos das aves no Brasil, mesmo que não necessariamente tenham pensado nisso. Bom, Bernardo, obrigada, palavra contigo, e agora vamos saber das soluções para o problema.
Boa noite, todo mundo. Obrigado pelo convite participar aí, Helena e o pessoal da STAR, Coaves, COA e toda a equipe. Eu sou arquiteto, projetista e, de fato, entrei nesse mundo recentemente, né? Eu tive contato com esse manual dos projetos de edificações amigáveis para pássaros, né? Com a tradução do material que é original da ABC. E estou aqui aprendendo hoje, vai ser para mim um prazer poder escutar esses dois profissionais aí, e depois também a Betânia com algumas soluções e começar a trazer isso para a nossa produção, né? Vou introduzir cada um dos nossos convidados em português e depois começar a conversar com eles em inglês mesmo. Nós vamos começar com o Michael Measure, que é diretor executivo e membro fundador do Fatal Light Awareness Program no Canadá, FLAP. Trabalhou com as 3 esferas do governo do Canadá para poder desenvolver políticas para a proteção de pássaros migratórios. E ele ajudou a produzir o FLAP's Bird Safe Building Standards, com sua correspondente ferramenta de auditoria. Michael, welcome and you may start.
Thank you. I'll get over here and let's see if I can get this right. From the beginning. There we go. Let's quickly advance here. Now, I'm going to suggest, if it's okay, and I don't know if it's too late for me to do it at this point, but I have very poor video sorry, internet connection. So I think disconnecting my video will help speed up the presentation a little bit. So let me do that and start. All right, just a little bit of background about FLAP Canada, who we are and what we do. We started out as a grassroots organization focusing specifically on the issue of bright lights at night at tall office towers here in Toronto. Several years after founding our organization, we found that this is a much bigger issue, a much bigger concern, because we also found that if we stuck around after daybreak, we would find these whole gamut of other birds we would encounter. In fact, upon staying after daybreak during our monitoring, we were picking up twice as many birds than those we would find before daybreak. So clearly, we were at that time very clearly learning that we're addressing 2 different issues. So as the organization evolved, we started more from a grassroots level, from a group of caregivers to working at a more advocacy level in education, collecting data, contributing to research. And then what we are primarily focusing on to the greatest degree now is on guidelines, policies, and standards developments across Canada and into the United States. And we have all kinds of other programs in place, which are listed at the below of the screen there, that involve ranging from working with architects, working with university campuses, working with children in schools. And then we also have our bird collision mapper, which I'll get into that in the next coming slides. So it would appear I'm having trouble here. If you could hold 1 second, I am going to try something else here. This is weird how this is all getting mixed up. Forgive me. And I will continue from here. So here's an image of what can look like a typical year's worth of birds collected by our volunteers. You're looking at our latest 2021 bird layout we use for educational purposes. And in this layout, you're seeing over 5,000 birds from over 50 species. Now, since we collected well over 90,000 birds from 173 species. So clearly demonstrating the fact that we're dealing with a very big problem. We have a long way to go in seeing some change take place. Our volunteers run around before daybreak. We looked like a bunch of crazy people when we first started, but now we're very, very well known, not only in the city of Toronto, but in other parts of the country. In fact, FLAP played an instrumental role in helping other organizations all over North America and into other parts of the world start FLAP-like initiatives in their city. Right across the United States, there's a whole gamut of Lights Out initiatives now, run primarily by National Audubon. But each and every one of these kind of developed similar models to FLAP, and it's now flourishing all over the United States, as I'm hoping perhaps Chris or Daniel may have mentioned earlier. Some of the more primary things that have really changed the landscape here, both in Canada and other parts of the world, is there was a number of steps it took to get this issue to the level of exposure it's now received. Back in 1995, FLAP developed the first bird-friendly building program in partnership with World Wildlife Canada. And since then, there's been a whole gamut of years where there's been transitions of changes taking place here in Canada, ranging from developing the first set of guidelines to it now being mandatory requirements for the city of Toronto to require bird-friendly architecture for any low, mid, and high-rise construction. And it's even law in both the province of Ontario and across the country, across Canada, that it is now illegal to harm or kill a migratory bird due to a collision with a window. And so all these things coming together, we've now developed the first of its kind by municipalities, other cities, architects, engineers to use right across the country. And with that, we're seeing this whole evolution of some incredibly beautiful architectural design that is being built with birds in mind, that was thought to be, before we managed to create the change here, was thought to be a threat to architectural integrity. But the architects are very quickly learning that this is adding a whole new aesthetic to building design that is actually very beautiful. And it's stepping away a little bit from that, lack of a better term, obsession with glass. And we're seeing more opaque materials that is meeting the criteria necessary to make glass visible to birds. So what I'm going to do now is kind of look at this more from a homeowner's perspective. And I thought before I get into various techniques and products that people could perhaps create on their own or purchase, it's important to kind of dispel the myths. And I think various presenters have already sort of touched on this, but I'm going to just go into a little bit of detail here. When this issue is looked at from, even more so from the commercial industry than, say, from the homeowner, and when you look at pest control products designed to what was thought to repel birds, it doesn't work in the case of bird building collisions. And this is a perfect example of a plastic owl that you can buy from a store that it was thought to scare the birds away from a given area. Well, as you can see, we find a bird right next to that plastic owl that had collided with the window just above that plastic owl. So it's important to abandon looking at this from a pest control issue and look at it from a bird conservation perspective. Now, this has also been touched on already, the birds of prey decals. One isn't enough, especially on large expanses of glass where all that other area of glass is exposed. You want to densen up that marker spacing so that that bird feels it can't fly through that given opening. Now, the other part of it is when markers are placed inside the windows, that outside surface of glass continues to reflect. And this image tries to demonstrate that, where it's hard to tell that, to a degree, that bird of prey decal is in fact there on that glass surface. So again, important that as much as possible, place markers on the outside surface of that glass. Now, I believe both Chris and Dan have touched on this, but it's always important to keep in mind what we'll call the formula necessary for a marker on a given window to work most effectively. Now, research has demonstrated that 5 centimeter by 10 centimeter spacing is sufficient to do the best in reducing strikes. Here in Toronto, that marker spacing has been tightened up a little bit. And it's not only to hopefully capture some of the smaller birds that can slip through smaller spaces, but it's also a more aesthetically appealing way of applying a marker on a given window surface that is less visually impeding for humans to look at. In fact, it can add again to the aesthetic beauty of the given building. So the spacing is important. Sorry, I advanced prematurely there, but that's not to be a concern here because you've already, in the previous presentations, touched on those given formulas. The other aspect of dealing with this at home is feeder placement. And as Dan and Chris will advocate, having done research on this themselves, that placing bird feeders at homes to appreciate birds that much more isn't something we want to discourage. But we certainly want to make sure wherever those feeders are placed, that they're not going to increase the potential for a bird to collide with that window. So please make sure, follow this formula of 0.5 meter or less from a given window surface, or 1.5 feet from a given window or less is ideal, okay? Try not to move it further away, or you're going to increase the potential for birds to collide with that window with more solid impact. Now, here's some tips you can try. The first one I'm showing here is basically drawing or painting with tempera paint on a glass surface. Now, this subject matter can be anything you want it to be. It doesn't have to be a maple leaf like you're seeing here. It doesn't have to be the shape of a bird of prey. It can be any shape because the bird doesn't care what that shape is. All it's doing is alerting the bird to the presence of that glass wherever you place that marker. The trick is to create a dense enough pattern so, again, the bird doesn't feel they can slip through those spaces. And this, again, is an example of painting on a given window in a repetitious pattern of a maple leaf. Another technique is parachute cords or cables that are hung in front of that window. Very important that the spacing be adequate enough, tight enough that, again, the birds feel they can slip through those gaps with relative ease. But these are techniques that you can build yourself. You do not have to go to a store and purchase them. But if you want to purchase a product like this online, you can purchase this. Daniel may very well covered this end up speaking about this. But as I said, there's a Copian bird savers. There's a number of products out there that if you search this online, you'll find it very quickly. You will also find this on ABC's website, on FLAP's website. There's various resources. Also, sunscreens, exterior sunscreens that can be purchased specifically for the purposes of reducing bird strikes. Again, it can be any pattern on that screen. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, but these are solar reflective sun blocking screens that hang in front of the window that when you're inside the home, you can see clearly through that the outdoors. It's almost like looking through a window with a screen on it, where it doesn't obscure your view. But from the outside, the birds, all they see is an opaque surface. You can have just plain white on those surfaces, or you can have patterns on the screens themselves. There's also grill work. If you want to decorate your home with its own aesthetic appeal, custom grill work placed again in front of that window on the outside surface of glass. There is an endless array of approaches to this. It's not one particular pattern that works. All you have to keep in mind is the spacing of that mark, feel they can't line through it, and the contrast itself allows that screening or that grill work to pop in the bird's eye, so it becomes more apparent to their vision. There's also just your simple screens in front of the window for ventilation. Many homes already have the window as much as you can, because birds are known to collide with screened windows as well. It does reduce the volume of strikes that occur with a given window, but by placing that and hanging that screen away from the surface of that glass, it's almost like a cushion effect, where the birds won't tend to have as much impact with that surface because it's slowed by the density of that screen that hangs in front of it. Again, there's products you can find online specifically for this purpose, or again, you can just adopt your own method at your own home. Ideally, if you have screens in front of your windows, keep them up, don't take them down, because it will help reduce that threat for collisions. And then there's window films. Window films themselves, there's all kinds of companies now that are reproducing a dotted pattern of a 5 by 5 centimeter spacing. But again, it does not have to be dots. You can approach this from a variety of perspectives. It can be a checkerboard effect. It can be zigzags. It can be anything you want it to be if you want a more custom approach. But again, if you want just your standardized package window film that you can just buy off the shelf, you can go online, Amazon, just search in Google, window film bird building collisions, and you'll find some companies out there that are producing product like this. Just make sure that whatever you end up adopting and applying to your window or in front of your window meets that criteria of spacing, contrast, surface, and the size of the marker itself. Because if you start to slip away from that and have greater in spacing and weaker contrast, you're going to find that that marker is going to be very quickly become less and less effective at reducing bird strikes. And then if you want, with your own home, we have an app that allows you to assess your own windows. It asks a series of questions, some 23 different questions. And what it will do is it will give you a rating, a very basic rating, that anything that falls under the lethal level, we highly recommend let those windows be the first windows you treat. It doesn't mean stop there, but those windows that receive that lethal rating are the most important for you to address right out of the starting gate. So please feel free to access that through the website you see up there, the flapapp.ca website. And also, please, if you find a bird that's collided with your home, you find a bird that's collided at your workplace or just on your way to work, your cottage, whatever it might be, please consider entering these records into our Global Bird Collision Mapper. This is a community science database where people all over the world are now starting to enter bird collision records into this database. We now have close to 70,000 records entered. We're starting to see more and more entries appear outside of the continent of North America. But for now, the bulk of the strike records are coming out of Canada and the United States. This is such an important part of giving everyone a deeper understanding of bird building collisions. It also helps some buildings that are having noted bird collision problems. They can find their own building right there on the global map, see records where birds have been colliding, and they can very quickly see which sides of their buildings are taking the most birds' lives. And again, those are the sides that are most important for one to address. And that is it. At this point, again, by the screen you can see here, I thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope I gave you a little by the end of the presentation. I'm here to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's very interesting for us to think in Brazil, as we're a tropical country with a lot of sun and warmth, we usually have some architects usually use brise soleils. There are some blades that we use to protect our window facades. So I think we actually have very much to use in architecture terms, in engineering terms, to benefit our buildings and also help the bird collision problem. So I see it much more as a solution than a problem for us as designers, and it was really good to see those ideas. I think we can now follow to Stefan Nust. Let me introduce him in Portuguese first, and then we'll follow. O Stefan, ele é diretor de sustentabilidade da Ennead Architects e é membro da Bird Safe Building Alliance, e ele contribuiu na criação, na autoria do Lead Pilot Credit 55, de Bird Collision Deterrence. Stefan, you may start now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo, and hola todos. I am an architect, and I thought that I would share my perspective, sort of the day in the life of an architect, and I would actually ask all of you to, let's see here, become an architect with me for 15 minutes. So first, let me know if the screen is successfully shared.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And trying to get full screen. All right, here we go. So architects have to answer lots of questions, and you just heard from the experts, from the scientists and from advocates and from solutions providers on how to deal with this issue. And you're right, it is a regional and a local issue. And so you're already recognizing that there are different types of solutions in different environments. And as architects, we work in those environments, and yet we keep hearing the same questions. And so we're just going to quickly go through the questions that we will always hear on this topic. And I can tell you, in my own office, we have a lot of experience with this, but I keep hearing the same questions. First of all, as an architect, which is represented on the right-hand side here, I'm certainly acting as a professional, and I need to understand the specifics while I am also describing how we are going to achieve a client's dream. And I also act as an advocate together with the American Bird Conservancy and the Audubon Society, and this is what all of you can do as well, because this is a particular passion of mine, and I think everybody can relate to this topic. So the most fundamental questions that architects have to answer have not been answered very well in the past, and I'm the first to admit this. We don't really understand the full consequences of some of our decisions that are happening at different scales. And today we're speaking about the impact upon birds, but there are many other significant issues that our design profession and construction industry is trying to address. We work in diverse environments. This is a bioclimate map of the United States, and a case study that I would like to share with you is illustrated on the top right, that dot. That's an environment near New York City at Vassar College. And certain site conditions were considered in our response. Here's the building that I would like to talk about, and there are certain building conditions that were also relevant to this topic. And then, of course, the material that we care about a lot as architects is glass. And this is one project where we really thought hard about the impact that glass has in terms of comfort, not only to human occupants inside and outside the building, but also, in this case, to birds. This was a very important question for this science precinct on the campus. And we learned a lot, and it was in this experience together with Dr. Shepard that we developed together a way in which architects can use the knowledge that we've gained and apply it as a tool. So first of all, when you're approaching a project, there will be questions that have to do with site factors and building factors such as the geometry. Will you be creating funnels where many birds will suddenly collide with particular windows, which a survey tool such as Michael's from FLAP might indicate as a priority? And what are the material factors that you are thinking about when you're selecting building materials? You have to be prepared to address all three of these things when you're approaching a project tomorrow when you apply this knowledge. I work in New York City. I work in One World Trade Center. I see these collisions that Chris was describing. And when I look up at the glass awning in the morning and I see small warblers up there, within a few hours, they're gone because seagulls are picking them up or squirrels are picking them off the ground. So they disappear quickly. So the environment of New York City is represented on the far right-hand side when you think of the landscape as different sectors of development versus natural environments. And when we build buildings in green fields, we're very concerned about bird collisions, but the truth is that they happen anywhere. I've been through Soho where there are hardly any trees, and I find dead birds during migration seasons on the sidewalk there too. So one thing to know is that collisions can happen anywhere in the city and in the countryside. Another thing that was mentioned earlier is that collisions do happen on buildings at multiple elevations, but most of them occur at the lowest level in the tree zone. And this has a lot to do with the patterns that birds go through when they migrate and have to forage every day, in particular in those cities to which they've been attracted by all the lighting that's on. And so, one way to think about this as a designer is to say, listen, the environments that we design for our clients and for our cities are the same environments that birds also find attractive because we like the same things. We like vegetation, we like water, we like habitat and food. And so that's easy to understand. Where it gets more difficult is to explain what's going on between these two extremes here. So on the left, I'm representing from a scale of 0 to 100, and on the left-hand side, you'll see a 100. That is easy to relate to as a person in a building. That would be a clear piece of glass or even a mirror. We all understand what that looks like. And we might even understand on the far right-hand side what a building element or a wall looks like that is not transparent or reflective. And the 0 in this case would represent a low risk collision instance, and on the far left would be a high risk condition. And everything in between is what we're talking about today in terms of mitigation strategies. But as architects, we have to understand it from both sides. What does this mean to the human experience as well? And how well does it work for birds? And the questions you'll have to answer are, well, how do we know? What do we mean and how do we know? And this is where testing comes into play. And you just heard from the world's leading researchers on this topic. They have been advising the glazing industry for decades, and the glazing industry has been looking for guidance, and guidance has emerged, again, through local advocacy and more through building codes. And we now know what certain types of strategies do in certain testing conditions. And what you need to be able to navigate later is, well, what do these different results actually mean, and what do we have to provide? So Chris already explained what a flight tunnel looks like and how it works. This is just a photograph of that. A bird enters one end and flies through the next and is then released. No birds are harmed in the tunnel. In that type of test, the bird is presented with two options. That's called binary choice protocol. And based upon the result of 80 to 100 flights, there is a scoring that occurs that can be indicative of how that material might perform in similar conditions. And the one thing you need to know is that there is not one solution for everything. And that's where it gets complicated. What's also complicated about the scoring, and what this is trying to illustrate, starting here in the middle, let's say 50% of the birds fly to the left and 50 birds fly to the right. That would indicate that you have two equally attractive or detractive samples that the birds are flying to. And there is no collision deterrence at all present. But if the birds begin to trend to one side, to the left, and they are avoiding the sample that you saw on the right, and you begin to generate sort of results like this, where 70 fly away from it and only 30 fly towards it, that is already considered a bird-friendly material. It has effectiveness that is meaningful. And what's happening now is that there are numbers based upon this methodology that are increasing now. So 25 is the number that was adopted by New York City very recently in a new law for new buildings. I think the Canadian standard has adopted a prescriptive approach that might rank even higher in terms of the scoring if it were in a tunnel. And I think the European baseline for what is considered to be bird friendly is even higher than that. So when you are designing for a bird safe condition, make sure you understand who your client is and what they're looking for, but also what the regulations are. And then explain that there is no foolproof system with windows or even solid walls. I've seen a bird fly into a solid wall. So technically, we have to provide specifications to our builders to put up the assemblies that meet all kinds of other criteria: safety, energy, transparency. And so glazing assemblies get very complicated, and there are additional questions that some of these tests cannot even answer, such as reflection and contrast. And of course, there are just infinite combinations of things, not only in the conditions within which your building is placed, but also in the assemblies that you are putting in your building. I think most of us here on the call recognize that these two images are in fact the same image, and that they are representing a duality, a reflected condition and a transparent condition. But as you heard before, birds don't understand this. They look for something attractive, or they react against something that's detractive. And this is confusing. And as architects, when we are specifying assemblies of glazing and frit strategies, we need to recognize that we will be sort of experiencing a variety of conditions. This is just a simple illustration to show you in 3 columns. The vertical column of dots on the left is all white. The vertical columns in the middle is gray, and the vertical column of dots is black. And when you superimpose that upon a scene like this, you'll notice that some of the dots just disappear. And yet architects tend to favor the gray dots because they don't make their buildings as bright as a white dot might. And black dots are less effective, because usually we're looking at buildings with darker interior backgrounds unless there are highly reflective coatings, and yet those coatings might even obscure the pattern that we've applied. Until recently, most glazing manufacturers would tell us, don't put any patterns on surface 1 because it won't last, put it on a protected surface on the interior, and yet with highly reflective films and coatings to keep out the high energy from the sun, those patterns get to be obscured by reflections. And these are things that architects need to understand and need to test with mock-ups with their clients, because you don't have test results yet that tell you exactly what to expect from a collision standpoint. And yet codes are emerging. And codes, by the way, are always reacting to an emergency, right? And luckily, codes are building upon knowledge that has been initiated by passionate people such as Dan and Chris and Mark, who have been addressing this topic for years. And so whether it's a local origin, whether it's a countrywide initiative, a lot has been happening, and this is even out of date, this slide. And the codes ultimately are built upon the knowledge that have previously been issued in guidelines. These are just some examples. And then they also take different perspectives on where they believe these high-risk conditions are. Some reference high-risk exposures to vegetation. Others look at the totality of the building surface. And perhaps the most practical ones say, look, let's just look at the zone where the trees are. That is where most collisions are occurring. And let's make sure we address those, because we can't solve everything, and yet we do know where we can have a major impact. So now for the case study. And I just have a few minutes left. I won't address all of these things, but these issues, site factors, building factors, and material factors all came into play for this particular design team. This happens to be the project that's on the cover of the current version of the Bird-Friendly Design Guide at ABC. And you'll see it's a campus setting where we have transparency and visibility desires, but we also have program that doesn't have to have 100% windows, as much as we like to do that too. It was on a site that contained a river. It had many slopes. It had a large landscape. In fact, we introduced more landscape back. It was an arboretum. And so all of the conditions that are so attractive to us and to the students, this is a research area for students, is also attractive, of course, to birds. So this is a prime candidate for potential collisions. We knew that because several of our team members were bird enthusiasts, and New York City is on a flyway that sees over 400 birds flying through annually during migration. We took a strategy to, first of all, integrate the building in a way that took clues from its immediate surroundings, in particular the trees. And we also developed strategies to reduce solar gains and to increase user comfort on the inside. And as inspiration, we looked to the trees themselves to create patterns, both in the opaque areas of the building, but also in the glazing. So this is where it's interesting. We took an approach here that considered two different technologies. The lower tier here of images represents a UV strategy, which was available. And we used that on the corridor, the central corridor, for maximum transparency and also for security purposes. And then in the upper laboratory zones, we introduced a two-tone frit pattern where we recognized that when we're standing inside as users, we like to look out through a darker color in order to mitigate glare. And yet when we are on the outside, to become visible, any pattern would have to be brighter. And this is sort of influenced from the trees. And this is a very custom approach, by the way, a double pass frit solution, which is quite elegant in itself and can't be accomplished on every project. But it was a multi-value proposition. It had many benefits. And in the end, it also became a tool for the students to learn how to build better environments that are safer for our avian friends. This is the lead pilot credit that emerged from that, which is essentially a geometry analysis and then an application of some of the knowledge that we're gaining through the tunnel testing. What we've done since then in the office is to turn this into an algorithm, and we push models through here, which then automatically look at a building design, which is in response to program and other factors. And then we begin to test the materiality of that, and notice the number here in the upper right. We were beginning to drive down the sort of risk condition here in terms of collisions, while still thinking about the human experience and all the other factors that dictate what in this case is an all-glass building. So in summary, it takes all of us to work together. Ultimately, what happens when birds are colliding is really the result of the interplay of light on a surface that they are not aware of, and so we have to provide a signal. Manufacturers have to rely upon the information that we're gaining from our scientists, and architects need to mediate this and manage expectations, but also know what they're talking about in developing new solutions. We are very hopeful that there will be computer models that can speed up the rate at which new solutions can be tested. And we are working with you, everyone here in the audience, together, both in terms of advocacy and in retrofit work, to make sure that we can continue to reduce collisions, because the birds do need our help. That's it.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Let me ask you, how do you think we can enforce this? I mean, we not only by laws and codes, but how can we bring the other stakeholders to get interested in it? I mean, especially the owners of the buildings, the contractors, and the ones that they are usually thinking about money and the looks of the building. How do we bring them to embrace this idea?
Yeah, well, there's many avenues for this. And I think the one that made the biggest impression upon me was when young children were presenting to the city council legislators talking about this problem and as co-signees to a proposed bill. They made a big impression on the political leaders that put this law into effect recently in New York City. And that's kind of part of an ongoing advocacy effort that I believe everybody on this call, I'm sure, is already part of in their own community. So that is key. Then I think also being able to explain that these solutions can solve many different types of problems, that you're not adding layers to restrict your enjoyment of nature, but that you are in fact enhancing your enjoyment of nature in a cost-effective way. There are many solutions available, and this should not be seen as an obstacle. And so there is some education involved as well.
And I also believe certifications like LEED, and we have Procel here.
Yes,
they could be very, very strong measures.
They could be very strong measures. You are right, and leading by example, is ultimately the best thing. So I think that once you build critical mass, then suddenly codes come into play, and then enforcement is easy. What is more difficult is retrofit. There are so many existing buildings that need to be addressed. This is a bit more challenging. I don't foresee New York City creating a law for retrofits. on this topic yet, anyway. But you know, maybe 10 years ago we didn't imagine that they would introduce this new law for new buildings either. So we're not giving up. And meanwhile, we are getting the attention of developers, and we're getting the attention of occupants, and they will drive this decision then, because people want to have more friendly buildings that they rent space in. And so I think it becomes a larger pressure, like a wave.
Sure. Michael, do you want to add something? I see you have your hands up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, Stefan just mentioned exactly what I was going to say. Here in Toronto, what we've noticed, especially with existing buildings, when people are, say, they're looking for new office space, and they go to a given building that they're perhaps interested in occupying for their business, then they say, of all the things that you're doing in your building, is your building bird friendly? Yes or no? No? Well, then impression on buildings here in Toronto. People are coming to buildings expecting them to be bird friendly. And what do? They look into retrofits. So I really think that education, definitely key. And it really is in the hands of the public as they move about their work and their entrepreneurship and so forth. They need to speak up, and they need to demand this type of architectural enhancements be in place at buildings.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Michael. It's a matter of education above all.
Yeah. I just want to say I like Michael's sort of tool that he introduced as well, because sometimes people feel overwhelmed when they think they have to address every window in their building. It's overwhelming to think of things that way. And yet there may be situations where one can prioritize. And so I like the idea that Michael is developing a tool that can help us assess these conditions and really begin where it's most effective. That to me seems really important when we are trying to answer our own questions, you know.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. We're going to move to... Sure, Michael?
Add to that. So go ahead. No, that's okay. That's fine. You should move on. There's only so much time. Thank you.
Yeah, let's move to Betania, and if we have time in the end, we will add some more questions, and you can answer them. Agora nós vamos receber a Betania Danelon, que ela é gestora nacional da equipe de gerentes técnicos da Guardian Glass, que é atuante há 20 anos no mercado da construção civil, ela é atuante há 20 anos no mercado de construção civil, sendo 9 deles dedicados à Guardian. Ela é graduada em arquitetura e urbanismo e está cursando um MBA em construções sustentáveis. Boa noite, Betania.
Boa noite, Bernardo. Boa noite, pessoal. Inicialmente, queria agradecer muito o convite para participar com vocês desse fórum, né, de um tema bastante relevante, e dizer que, ao mesmo tempo que eu vou compartilhar algumas soluções arquitetônicas, né, eu também estou aprendendo muito aqui com todos os palestrantes, então tem sido um aprendizado constante, né, a gente não para nunca de aprender. Eu vou dividir a minha tela aqui, tá, Bernardo, só um minutinho, para poder... começar a falar com o pessoal.
Fica à vontade.
Me avisa quando eu estiver já compartilhando aqui com vocês. Tá aparecendo a minha tela?
Tá ok.
Obrigada. Então, pessoal, como o Bernardo comentou, né, meu nome é Betania, sou arquiteta graduada aqui pela Unicinos, né, em São Leopoldo, e atuo praticamente, né, vou completar 10 anos aí com a Guardian, em março do ano que vem. E foi um prazer receber esse convite para compartilhar um pouco com vocês sobre algumas soluções bird-friendly glass solutions com vocês, porque o vidro, né, quando a gente se preocupa e atende todas as especificações bem no início do projeto, a gente pode usar ele como aliado. Então, só para localizar um pouquinho com vocês aqui, até o professor Daniel comentou, né, a Guardian é uma indústria, uma multinacional americana, situada em Michigan, e aqui no Brasil a gente tem 2 plantas, né, então a gente vê aqui que principalmente a nossa sede e a nossa localização no Brasil, a gente está no principal local onde a gente tem essa migração de aves, né? Então, super relevante que a gente fale, que a gente se interesse, que a Guardian invista em soluções, né, para trabalhar junto com os arquitetos, construtoras e com os demais interlocutores dos projetos. Então, eu queria compartilhar um pouquinho com vocês qual é o nosso desafio e que eu tenho visto gradualmente aqui com cada um dos palestrantes, é justamente quando a gente vai fazer um projeto arquitetônico, a gente fazer esse casamento entre a luz natural, que é necessária para o ser humano, mas, ao mesmo tempo, projetar, né, construir um projeto que pense também na segurança das aves, para que faça o quê? Mitigue essa colisão, né, que a gente já viu a professora Christine, o professor Daniel aí, o Stefan e o Michael comentando, tem sido cada vez maior por conta do que a gente tem construído. E quando a Helena me trouxe esse desafio, eu pensei, como que eu posso agregar um pouco de conhecimento, como eu posso trazer soluções para que a gente siga projetando, né, com bastante luz natural, mas mitigue esse impacto negativo, né, que projetos ou áreas envidraçadas que não foram bem pensadas anteriormente causam na nossa natureza. Então, eu trouxe aqui para vocês algumas práticas, tá? Até a Helena me pediu que eu trouxesse alguns cases que a gente tem aqui no Brasil para trazer um pouco mais para a nossa realidade. E eu confesso que eu puxei na minha memória desses quase 10 anos aí de trabalho e eu não consegui encontrar, pessoal, né, principalmente os arquitetos aqui, nenhum projeto, nenhuma vez que eu ou a minha equipe, né, para não mentir, uma vez, fomos perguntados pelos arquitetos, pelas construtoras, sobre soluções bird-friendly, tá? Para dizer que teve uma única vez, a gente tem um projeto no Espírito Santo, onde realmente essa preocupação com a segurança, né, com salvar as vidas dos pássaros foi predominante, e a gente desenvolveu uma solução que eu vou compartilhar aqui com vocês também, tá? Não vou poder compartilhar o projeto por questões de confidencialidade, mas eu vou poder compartilhar a solução que a gente pode utilizar para mitigar, né, essa situação aí que a gente tem visto aí no decorrer do workshop. Então, a gente pode sim construir, né, com vidro, e, ao mesmo tempo, proteger os pássaros. O que a gente precisa para que isso aconteça? Eu consegui destacar 2 pontos aqui em toda a pesquisa que eu fiz, inclusive li todo o manual da ABC, da FLAP também, justamente para que a gente pudesse entender. A Guardian nos Estados Unidos, inclusive, tem um setor de desenvolvimento de produtos bird-friendly. Então, a gente precisa, primeiro, ter estratégias de design de fachada, e isso tem que vir lá no início, né, quando eu estou concebendo o meu projeto arquitetônico, e se mesmo assim, né, o vidro é o personagem principal, protagonista da fachada, eu posso entrar com o quê? Com especificações de vidro, né, e claro, em retrofits ou em situações mais domésticas, a gente tem já soluções aí que o pessoal apresentou dos stickers, tá? Então, falando em design de fachada, eu vou compartilhar com vocês aqui algumas soluções que eu encontrei nos projetos que a gente participou junto com as equipes de arquitetura e construtora, onde, como eu disse para a Helena, o propósito inicial, a solicitação não foi especificamente bird-friendly, mas a arquitetura como um todo e as soluções que foram adotadas de fachada acabaram auxiliando a mitigar o impacto das aves nos vidros, né? Então, eu trago para vocês, deixa eu só tirar aqui essa minha janelinha que está na frente, ó. A gente tem, inclusive, aqui no Rio Grande do Sul, esse projeto, que é o Sicredi de Marau, onde a gente trabalhou com a equipe de arquitetura e o pessoal que fez toda a parte do estudo de eficiência energética, um brise com desenho junto com o vidro, e com isso a gente conseguiu entregar um prédio que tivesse uma preocupação aí de mitigar esse impacto na fachada envidraçada, porque ele reduz essa questão da reflexão do vidro, ele vem na frente do vidro. Tá? Da mesma forma, né, quem é aqui de Porto Alegre, a gente tem a Unicinos, né, na Nilo Peçanha, onde a gente tem também uma colocação de brises, tá? Por fora dessa fachada envidraçada. Como que a gente faz, né? Eu vi que algum pessoal perguntou, como é que a gente faz para conciliar isso junto com as construtoras? Uma dica importante é que isso venha desde o partido geral da arquitetura, porque para justificar depois a questão de custos é preciso que aquilo faça parte do escopo do projeto, né? Então, nesse caso da Unicinos, a gente conseguiu entregar o conforto térmico necessário, mas também fazer com que essa fachada mitigasse, né, a questão do impacto das aves nessa fachada envidraçada. Da mesma forma, a gente tem o Sicredi em Pelotas, onde o arquiteto projetou um trabalho de brisas um pouco mais espaçado, tá? Conforme a gente viu aí, quanto mais fechada essa malha, mais efetiva ela é, né? Até por questão da dimensão do corpo do pássaro e da abertura das asas, mas também aqui no Sicredi de Pelotas, com esse jogo de brises que foi feito por fora, né, da pele de vidro, também auxiliou essa questão da colisão dos pássaros. E a gente tem também um projeto que está quase pronto aí em São Leopoldo, eu vi que tem alguém de São Leopoldo participando aqui com a gente, também foi adotada uma estratégia. Então, a gente tem um vidro de controle solar na fachada envidraçada, né, no caixilho, e por fora a gente tem umas telas protendidas. O que isso faz? Faz ao mesmo tempo que a gente entregue conforto térmico para os ocupantes, a gente também proporcione esse material que o pássaro é capaz de ver e conseguir desviar para que ele não tenha essa colisão, tá? Então, aqui depois compartilho também com vocês mais uma imagem do projeto de Sicredi Marau, que realmente é um projeto bastante, muito interessante, acho que vale a pena conhecer, tá, pessoal? E aí, falando de soluções já no vidro, então, eu fiz o meu projeto e eu já não tenho mais como colocar elementos alternativos na fachada e o que está beirando a fachada é somente vidro. Como que a gente pode mitigar, né, e auxiliar aí o nosso meio ambiente para que os pássaros não tenham essa colisão? Então, como já foi falado, existem esses adesivos que podem ser colocados no vidro, né, após o prédio já ter sido construído. Até trouxe uma foto aqui da York University em Toronto, no Canadá, que eu achei bastante interessante, que eles adesivaram justamente esses círculos, essas bolinhas, para mitigar essa questão do impacto, tá? E depois a gente tem soluções definitivas que a gente pode projetar nos vidros, né? Porque os adesivos são para quê? Para quando a gente já tem uma situação de arquitetura consolidada e a gente não tem mais, ou não quer, ou não pode, não tem budget para trocar o vidro. Então, o que a gente pode fazer quando a gente vai para uma nova construção? A gente pode propor essa trama, esse desenho no próprio vidro. A gente chama isso de serigrafia. Não sei se o pessoal conhece um pouco sobre essa técnica, né, que é aplicada sobre o vidro. Nessa serigrafia, a gente faz o desenho que lembra os stickers que foram colocados. Qual é a vantagem dessa serigrafia? É uma solução definitiva, então isso nunca mais sai do vidro e eternamente aquele vidro ali vai ser um vidro que vai evitar, né, a colisão dos pássaros. A melhor face, eu acho que foi o Stefan que falou sobre a face de aplicação, sempre é a face 1, ou seja, a face que fica para o exterior, para que justamente o próprio reflexo do vidro não atrapalhe que o pássaro veja essa malha, esse desenho, ou essas bolinhas, ou essas listras, tá? Então, essa é uma solução que a gente pode propor nos nossos projetos de arquitetura, né? Mas precisa vir especificado. Se a gente não especifica, é bastante difícil que haja essa mobilização depois que o prédio já está em construção. Aqui eu estou trazendo para vocês um projeto também na Eslovênia, tá? Onde foi feito justamente esse trabalho de serigrafia. Então, vocês podem ver na foto bem da direita que foi escolhido um desenho, um pattern, né, específico do hotel e foi feito nos vidros de todo o prédio. E isso evita também a questão da colisão dos pássaros, tá? Depois, aqui no Brasil, a gente falando em outras soluções que a gente pode propor aí, mas também, né, sempre falando em projeto. Tem o projeto da Natura em São Paulo, não sei se alguém conhece, ele já foi super divulgado na revista Projeto, na ArcDaily. É um projeto bastante preocupado com essa questão de sustentabilidade, de conforto, e eles fizeram uma proposição super estratégica aqui, que também, por consequência, ajuda a mitigar o problema da colisão dos pássaros. Então, o que foi feito? Vocês podem ver que eu coloquei setinhas indicando ali. Existe a fachada original, onde tem um vidro que proporciona conforto térmico, e existe uma fachada adicional, que são uns brises de vidro. E o que foi feito nesses brises de vidro? Justamente a serigrafia que eu comentei para vocês. O que essa serigrafia proporcionou? 3 coisas, na verdade. Primeiro, ela ajuda o usuário do prédio a não ter ofuscamento pelo excesso de luz, ajuda no conforto térmico, e o terceiro é a questão que a gente está conversando hoje, ajuda a mitigar a colisão dos pássaros contra essa área de vidro. E aqui, só para vocês terem uma ideia, né, da vista de dentro para fora, o que o usuário vê, ele consegue ter essa conexão com o exterior, né, vê essa malha, que é bastante suave, mas continua recebendo a iluminação natural e o conforto. Tá? Então, são soluções que a gente pode aplicar ao vidro para mitigar essa questão da colisão dos pássaros. Então, aqui é apenas outra visão, tá? Para vocês entenderem, aqui dá para ver um pouquinho mais aqui na foto da esquerda ali, as 2 fachadas, ainda tem uma outra fachada aqui, que em vez do brise de vidro, foi colocado um brise de alumínio, então tem todo esse trabalho da arquitetura aqui para dar conforto e mitigar também essa questão das aves. E existe uma outra solução também que a gente pode fazer no vidro, tá? Quando a gente tem a oportunidade de especificar, que é o vidro acidato, tá? Antigamente a gente conhecia ele como vidro jateado, mas o vidro jateado não existe mais, né? É um processo que foi extinto, porque ele faz mal para a saúde de quem faz o processo, né, do jateamento. Então, o vidro acidato. E o vidro acidato pode ser o quê? Ele pode também ter um desenho, ou pode ser totalmente fosco. E aí eu trouxe alguns exemplos aqui para vocês entenderem um pouco essa estratégia que a gente pode adotar. Então, por exemplo, aqui na esquerda é uma foto de um hotel, então eles usaram um pouco o vidro totalmente acidato, então deixa ele opaco, com uma leve transparência. No meio, já essa acidação em listras. E nessa loja da Volvo aqui, que eu achei super interessante, eles mesclaram, né, um vidro pintado com um vidro acidato e uma parte de vidro transparente. Então, a gente pode fazer essa composição para alcançar esse objetivo. E por último aqui, que o meu tempo já está se esgotando, eu queria trazer para vocês uma solução que a Guardian desenvolveu nos Estados Unidos, que foi o professor Daniel até comentou, que é o vidro que tem justamente esse coating UV, né? Então, qual é o resultado disso? É um vidro que nós humanos enxergamos ele totalmente transparente, mas que os pássaros são capazes de ver esse desenho das listras no vidro, tá? Então, é a melhor solução, mais sofisticada que a gente teria hoje, mais tecnológica, onde a gente mescla o desejo da arquitetura de ter um vidro sem nenhum desenho realmente aparente, mas, ao mesmo tempo, proporcionar que os pássaros vejam aquela parede de vidro. Queria agradecer aqui, poder compartilhar um pouco do que a gente faz com vocês, tá? Deixo os meus contatos aqui embaixo, então se alguém tiver alguma dúvida, alguma sugestão, porque a gente está sempre fazendo pesquisas, a gente tem um centro de tecnologia em Auburn Hills, em Michigan, a gente está sempre coletando informações, né, dos profissionais para poder desenvolver produtos melhores. Obrigada, Bernardo.
Obrigado, Betânia. Eu até já vou emendar aqui, era uma dúvida meio minha, mas que alguém perguntou aqui também. Quando a gente tem, você mostrou principalmente as soluções de vidro, né, seja o serigrafado, seja o acidato, elas, quando você aplica isso, você tira um pouco da visibilidade de dentro para fora, né? Mas elas não chegam a interferir, concorda?
Exato, como eu mostrei naquele projeto da Natura, né? A gente tem o desenho das bolinhas, né? Então, ela tira um pouco da visibilidade, porque, inclusive, a serigrafia é por graduação, né? Existe serigrafia 20%, 30%, 50%, né? Mas o usuário continua tendo aquela conexão com o exterior, né? Então, quem quiser dar um Google aí na ArcDaily ou na revista Projeto NASP, que é a sede da Natura, vocês vão ver várias fotos de dentro para fora desse projeto, incrível, né? Mantém a conexão, então é uma solução bastante interessante.
Joia. Vou fazer algumas perguntinhas aqui, e aí vou para o inglês aqui, né, para o Stefan e para o Michael. Michael and Stefan, I'm going to ask you some of the questions that we got from the viewers, and any of the three of you can answer, sorry. Let me see. The ultraviolet windows, have they been used in large scales, large buildings? How expensive is this solution compared to any other glass solution? I mean, is it really, is it hard to use, especially financially speaking?
Well, let me answer by saying we have used the
ultraviolet. Yeah.
It is often our first choice as well to use a solution such as that, and there are more emerging. It is true that the price per square foot has generally come in higher than other solutions, or no solution, of course. And it's a very common situation that the contractor will come to the owner and say, I can save you money. And then we have to remind the owner why we made a decision to specify this particular glass, because we're solving multiple problems, not just collisions. But the prices are coming down. I want to end on that comment to say the prices are coming down because there is more interest and use.
Michael?
Yeah, and I kind of echo that sentiment. I do believe, again, I can only base it on what we're seeing and we're experiencing up here in Toronto. UV glass is still on the more expensive side compared to some of the other alternatives. And, you know, let's face it, the invisible fix is still one of the most desired, sought after approaches because it just eliminates that concern of threatening architectural integrity of a given building design. But I think people got to give this window marker evolution a bit of a chance, because you speak to local architects here in Toronto, the ones that really resisted, you know, the city planners, the glass fabricators, the window manufacturers, were all resisting, you know, covering up more of the glass surface. And they're realizing it's actually a very aesthetically appealing approach because it's infinite. There's infinite approaches you can take to treating a window outside of an invisible fix like UV that, again, can be aesthetically appealing. So let's give it a chance a little bit more and not limit ourselves to the invisible fix of ultraviolet light.
I totally agree with you, Michael. And let me ask you something else. How do you see city planning? What's the role of city planning, transitioning towns, and all those concepts? Because we're talking about the buildings and the architecture itself, but how can we prepare our cities to be more receptive to non-human fauna and especially birds? That's our main theme.
I'll start by saying cities, I think, have always aimed to provide healthy environments. So even more now after the pandemic, I think healthy communities is foremost on any city planner's mind. And to me, healthy biodiversity is a very much a part of that type of healthy community. And there are, again, science is helping us. Evidence-based information is helping us understand how cities can be planned for migratory corridors and for solutions, not just for birds, but other species as well. And again, we're seeing movement, but it's generally reactive and sometimes too slow. But I'm optimistic that we're seeing a change, a positive one.
Right. And I can add a little bit more to that. One thing in the experience of working with the City of Toronto, developing their guidelines and standards, tourism is very, very much a big part of a city, a large metropolis like the city of Toronto. And when you look at how much the birdwatching industry can in fact be a part of a large city, attracting people to the city outside of just going to watch birds. So if you can make this attractive to a city planner by looking also at this from a tourist industry perspective, it does increase the chances of some more buy-in. And look, you just also have to find yourself a city councillor that just really believes in this. And it's amazing what can come together. Just one councillor can cause this whole flow of an entire city embracing something. So just trying to work with local city councillors can be a big, big part of seeing this happen in your own city.
There is one really intriguing question here. Someone asked about airport control towers. They have the visibility is a main concern. And well, despite UV windows, all the other solutions, they may block the view somehow. So is the UV window the only solution, the only solution, or do you see any other for some specific buildings, such as a control tower?
Interesting.
Well,
I'll speak briefly to that. I'll just try and get this one out. I don't know if I'm right here, but when I see air traffic control towers, I've noticed that the architectural design of those spaces, the glass is very, very much so angled on almost a 45-degree downward position. And there is some evidence that suggests angled glass, especially the more you angle that glass, reflecting less desired opaque materials or concrete and steel and so forth. There's a lesser need, perhaps, for window markers to go on a specialized. It's not creating that environment where birds will be more inclined to collide with those given windows. But I can see that being a concern with some buildings like air traffic control towers, where they have to have an unobscured view of the outdoors, and perhaps UV is the only solution for that.
Yeah, I think that there will be instances where other concerns override some of these particular solutions, but I would also look at the air traffic control tower in the context of the entire airport and look at the entirety of glazing that is there, along with the accompanying risk factors such as vegetation and water and sources of food, to really see, whether there are other areas of the airport that might need attention. And I'm sorry, that's not answering the question exactly, but
No, I think it was really good. I have one last question here. Someone is talking about green facades, and although they are not window or anything, I think it was Michael who said something about the closeness of the bird feeders to windows. And then I asked if maybe the green facades can actually become a hazard somehow.
Forgive me, but are you saying green facades?
Yes. Sorry.
And sorry, I must have missed something, but a green facade, you're talking about a treated window in general, or, and I'm sorry if I missed some information there, but is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think we've been seeing, at least here in Brazil, some solutions to making green walls with lots of vegetation and vertical gardens.
Oh, I see.
And stuff like this.
Right. Well, long and short of it is green walls placed in front of windows I can't say I have had any direct experience with seeing birds colliding with facades like that. Again, a green facade, it could almost be considered like a treated window in of itself. If that growth in front of that window is dense enough, and that growth is right up against the windows themselves, the likelihood of strikes must drop significantly to the point where, I personally wouldn't be concerned with that. Others may argue that. Chris, Dan, if you're in this, want to get into this as well, I think there's some experience that you might be able to take to this. But if you're talking about vegetation grown in front of windows, I would have to say on a scale, I'm not near as concerned as an untreated window with nothing in front of it, right?
Great, thanks. I think we have covered all the questions here. If you guys want to add something else. Can get back to Elena.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, Michael, and Betania. It was I think you covered what we was looking for this panel. Great presentations, and probably we will follow up because so many practical things that we would like to see in the future. And we are very glad that you join us in this second panel. So thank you a lot. Thank you. Obrigada, Bernardo. Moderação just in time. Correu tudo ótimo. E, bom, amanhã a gente tem o segundo dia de evento e nós vamos ter um painel, o primeiro painel dedicado à parte da legislação, das normas, um tema que já apareceu aqui e que a gente vai cobrir com mais detalhe, tanto no que já existem de normas no Brasil, o que já pode ser aplicado e o que a gente tem que fazer para levantar que mais normas sejam incluídas nas cidades, que vai ser o principal fórum para decisão em torno do que se pode ou não construir. E depois, por último, nós vamos ter uma mesa redonda com o Pedro Develey e a Ananda Porto, jornalista do Terra da Gente, e o Luciano Lima vai moderar esse painel, e nós vamos discutir num modelo mesa redonda sobre como sensibilizar, como chegar lá, como fazer com que as empresas, os arquitetos, os vereadores, as prefeituras se sensibilizem por esse tema e passem a considerar isso na sua pauta. E, por último, a gente termina com 40 minutos amanhã de participação mesmo do público. Eu peço desculpas que a gente, para tirar partido dos palestrantes internacionais, a gente foi com menos participação nessa parte do evento, mas amanhã vai ter tempo de contribuição e, especialmente, aqui a gente quer pedir que vocês já se preparem para contribuir amanhã no sentido propositivo. O que a gente vai fazer daqui para diante? Como é que a gente vai se organizar para que isso não seja só um evento que a gente se ilustrou sobre o tema, mas que a gente consiga, a partir de agora, agir sobre ele. Então é isso. Muito obrigada a todos e uma boa noite.